She was already dead when he knelt beside her. Not recently dead, the kind of dead where the body has already started the process of becoming something else, where the face loses the tension that made it a face and becomes a surface instead. Exil Kresh, the Emperor's own apprentice. Modified beyond any normal Sith training, her mind threaded with the Emperor's presence, the way wire runs through a wall. Invisible from the outside, structural, impossible to remove without destroying everything around it. She had been the most dangerous target the Dark Council had ever assigned to a single operative. Teneb Kel had killed her in the ruins above the Valley of the Dark Lords. Now he was kneeling in the red dust of Korriban, looking at what she had left behind and trying to decide what came next. The ruins around him were old. Not Old Republic old, older than that. Stone carved during an era when the Sith species still occupied this planet in numbers, when the valley below was a living place rather than a monument. The wind moved through the gaps in the broken walls without stopping. It never stopped on Korriban. The planet had a patience to it, a quality of waiting that most beings felt as pressure and most Sith eventually learned to use. Kel did not feel pressure at the moment. He felt empty in a particular way. The emptiness that follows a thing you have been building toward for weeks, the sudden absence of a fixed objective. The mission was done. Kresh was dead. The assignment was complete, and he owned nothing. That was the thought that kept returning. Not pride, not fear, not grief for Califo, his arrested master. Just that single flat fact. A former slave with a completed mission and no object in the galaxy that genuinely belonged to him. The tools in his pack were Imperial issue. The clothes on his back were mission standard. Even the boots had been requisitioned. Then his eye moved to the debris near the collapsed wall. Something was buried there. Partially, a long shape under fallen stone, the housing visible at one end. Dark metal, heavy construction. A design he recognized from the archives he had spent years studying without authorization. A saber staff. Double-bladed, Dark Council grade. Its owner was not nearby. Its owner was not anywhere. He crossed to it and pulled it free from the rubble. The weight was significant. This was not a weapon built for someone who needed to move quickly. It was built for someone who never needed to run. The hilt alloy was cortosis weave. The emitter housings at both ends were precision machined to tolerances that standard Sith weapons did not bother with. Kel turned it over twice. Then he opened the crystal housing. Both kyber crystals were red, already bled, already forced through the Sith process of fracturing their force alignment and rebuilding it around someone else's will. Deep red, the color of old brick in low light. They sat in their housing with the density of things that had been through something difficult and come out changed on the other side. He pried both free with the tool from his kit. The original hilt he left in the rubble. Someone else's weapon was someone else's history. The crystals were raw material now, components, not relics. He pocketed them and spent the next hour moving through the upper ruins until he found what he needed. A sealed antechamber 3 levels below the surface, old enough that the walls held no inscriptions, only the marks of chisels that had started work, and then stopped for reasons the stone did not explain. The door sealed from inside. He set his tools out on the floor in the order he intended to use them. Construction took 3 days. The first was the housing, cortosis weave durasteel for the body. He had brought enough salvage material from the fallen weapon to work with. Dark synth leather for the grip, wrapped tight, tested twice, then rewrapped. The double blade design was a choice that took no time at all to make. A single blade was a tool. 2 blades were something else. A declaration, maybe. Or just the physical expression of a man who had spent 20 years being told what he was permitted to carry. He worked through the cold. 3 levels down, the temperature of Korriban dropped sharply, regardless of what the surface was doing. By evening, his hands had stiffened. The work continued anyway. The second day was internal assembly, power cell, emitter matrices, the focusing lens system, the component that demanded the most precision, because misalignment at these tolerances did not produce a weak blade. It produced a dangerous one. Every part went in twice. Checked before installation, checked after. 2 points required adaptation. When salvage components introduced tolerances the documentation had not accounted for. The first adaptation was straightforward. The second meant dismantling a finished emitter housing and rebuilding it from a different angle. No cursing, no stopping, just the rebuilding. By the end of the second day, the internal assembly was solid. The balance sat slightly forward of ideal, not badly, but noticeably. A wrap adjustment compensated for most of it. Not a perfect solution, a real one. The third day was the crystals. Tuning a kyber crystal to a new owner is not a loud process. There is no visible light, no sound, no dramatic shift in the room. It is a matter of presence, of pushing everything a person is into a stone, until the stone stops belonging to a dead person's history and starts belonging to yours. Kel held the first crystal in his closed fist for 2 hours. Into it went everything he carried. The slave quarters on Ziost, the smell of Caliph Halifo's archive, and the particular quality of light through its narrow windows. The Dark Council chamber where Senior Sith had looked at him, the way people look at furniture. The weeks of the mission, Kresh's face, the moment the fight ended. The crystal accepted him. Not dramatically. A quality shift, the difference between holding something and holding something that recognizes your grip. He set it down and picked up the second one. 3 hours this time. Somewhere in the second hour, a fracture moved through the crystal's internal structure. A thin diagonal line through the core. Too small to see, too small to feel, irrelevant to function. The bleeding completed. The stone accepted his presence the same way the first one had. He did not know the fracture was there. Both crystals went into their housings. The housing sealed. The completed weapon sat on the floor of the antechamber in the light of a single portable lamp. Kel looked at it for a long time. Then he reached out and picked it up. Heavier than expected. He had assembled every component with his own hands, and still the finished weight surprised him. Parts had one weight. The completed object had another. Something added in the assembly that was not in any individual piece. Both hands on the center of the hilt first. Then one hand. Then both again. He moved to the center of the chamber and activated it. The sound came first. A long intake of breath, held. Then twin beams of deep red, extended from both emitter housings simultaneously. And the antechamber filled with a color that had no equivalent in rooms that did not contain active Sith weapons. Korriban stone is dark red to begin with, the mineral composition that gives the planet its look from orbit, the appearance of something that has been burning for a very long time and simply will not finish. In the light of those twin blades, the walls went the color of something alive. Shadows moved as the grip shifted. The ceiling was low enough that the saber staff stayed horizontal. Both blades extended sideways. The weight distribution changing subtly as the active crystals warmed. He stood there and did not swing it. Did not run a form. Did not practice a sequence. Just held it and let the fact of it exist. That this thing was real, that 4 days ago it had not been. That had been made by his hands in a sealed room from components no one had given him, and it was his. Slaves do not own. The concept is not permitted in the vocabulary of ownership. Everything touched belongs to someone else. Everything used is borrowed without the word borrowing ever being applied. Everything held is held temporarily in someone else's name. 20 years of that. 20 years of taking everything he knew from places it was not given. This was the first thing he had made. He deactivated the weapon. Red light gone. The chamber returned to the dim yellow of the lamp. Stone walls, cold floor. the tools laid out beside him in the order he had used them. He clipped the saber staff to his belt. Dawn on Korriban is slow. The sky moves from black to the color of rust in stages, the light coming up over the valley with the patience of something that has done this every day for millions of years and is not in any particular hurry. Kel came up out of the ruins into that light with the new weapon at his side and did not look back at the place where Kresh had died. He did not look at the valley either. The tombs of Marka, Ragnos, and Tulak Horde pressed into the cliffs below, the inscriptions worn smooth by centuries of wind, the silence that those places kept so completely it felt deliberate. He walked toward the transport. There was a mission report to deliver. There was a name to demand, the name from the vision, the one that had come to him clear and cold during the assignment. Thanaton, an ancient Sith designation, connected to preserved knowledge, to the tradition of the old lords, to everything he had consumed in Califo's archive during years of unauthorized reading. In the vision he had been seated, powerful, surrounded by the architecture of real authority. He had decided the vision was not a prediction, it was an instruction. The saber staff moved at his side as he crossed the red ground toward the landing platform. The synth leather grip, the cortosis hilt, both emitters dormant, the twin crystals sitting in their aligned housings. One clean, one carrying a fracture that no one yet knew existed. The man walking toward the transport did not have a name yet. By the end of the day, that would change. The weapon at his side would remain exactly as it was. The name changed everything and nothing. Darth Thanaton walked out of the Dark Council chamber with a title, a sphere of influence, and the same weapon he had carried in. The Council had given him the name, the saber he had made himself. In the years that followed, that distinction would matter more than he ever said out loud. The Great Galactic War had another 25 years left in it. He intended to use every one of them. The first year under the new name was the hardest. Not because of enemies, not because of rivals, but because of the gap between what a title promised and what it actually delivered. Thanaton had a position now, a formal place in the Sith hierarchy. What he did not have was a power base, a network of loyal subordinates, or the kind of institutional trust that senior Sith built over decades of careful alliance making. He had a name and a weapon. Everything else had to be constructed. He approached this the way he approached the saber staff's construction, methodically, without rushing, checking each component before installing it. He studied the existing power structures within his sphere of influence the way he had studied Califo's documents. Completely, without asking permission, taking note of every weakness and every point where the structure diverged from its stated purpose. There were many such points. The Sith hierarchy presented itself as a meritocracy. The strongest rise, the weak fall. The hierarchy reflects genuine capability. What Thanaton found in practice was something more complicated. Connections mattered. Lineage mattered. The right master, the right academy cohort, the right patron on the Dark Council. These things moved people upward, independent of actual ability. The hierarchy was not corrupt exactly. It was human, which was nearly the same thing. He filed this observation away and said nothing about it to anyone. By the 5th year, the Saber Staff had its first significant history, a campaign on the Outer Rim, one of dozens running simultaneously across the war's broad front, had required Thanaton's personal involvement when the commanding officer made a series of decisions that were going to cost the Empire a strategically valuable position. Thanaton arrived, assessed the situation, relieved the officer of command, and led the final engagement himself. The Saber Staff came out of its dormancy for the first time since Korriban. Combat with a double-bladed weapon at this level is not elegant. It is efficient. The design demands a fighting style built around control of space, rather than individual exchanges. The second blade functions as a deterrent. Constant threat at the range behind the primary arc, forcing opponents to divide their attention between two active dangers. Thanaton had trained for this during the years between his naming and the campaign. The training showed. The engagement lasted 11 minutes. Afterward, he cleaned the weapon carefully in his quarters on the command vessel, going over each emitter housing with a cloth, checking the crystal alignment through the inspection port. Everything was as it should be. He clipped it back to his belt and wrote the after-action report in the same measured tone he used for everything. The saber staff went back to its place at his side. It would stay there for the next 20 years. The synth leather wrap was replaced for the second time in the 12th year, not because it had failed. The original material was durable, and Thanaton maintained it carefully, but because the grip had compressed over a decade of daily contact, flattening slightly under the constant pressure of the same hand in the same position. The balance change was small. He noticed it anyway. He ordered new synth leather from an imperial supplier, specified the density and thickness to the millimeter, and rewrapped the hilt himself over the course of an evening. The old wrap went into the disposal unit without ceremony. He did not keep it. That same night, during the routine inspection that followed any maintenance work, he found the fracture. It was visible only under the magnification lens he used for crystal checks. A thin diagonal line running through the core of the second crystal, too fine to affect the blade in any measurable way, present nonetheless. He held the inspection lens over the housing for a long moment, looking at it. Then he set the lens down. He thought about what it would take to replace the crystal. The process was straightforward. Remove the fractured stone, source a new one, bleed it, install it. 3 days of work, perhaps 4. The result would be a technically superior weapon, both crystals pristine, both performing at identical optimal levels. He decided against it. The fracture had been there since the beginning, since the antechamber on Korriban, since the 3rd day of construction, since a bleeding ritual performed by someone who did not fully know what he was doing, with tools that were partially salvaged, and components that did not all match their specifications. Removing that crystal would be a form of revision, of claiming the beginning had been cleaner than it was. Thanaton did not revise. He closed the inspection port and set the weapon down on his desk. The fracture stayed. The philosophy built itself slowly, the way most genuine convictions do, not arrived at all at once, but accumulated through experience, until the shape of it became clear. Tradition was not sentiment. That was the core of it, the part that separated his thinking from the nostalgic attachment to the old ways that he occasionally saw in other senior Sith. Men and women who valued the past because the past had been good to them personally, who confused their own comfort with structural principle. Thanaton had no such confusion. His past had not been good to him. He had been a slave. The old order had owned him before he was old enough to understand what ownership meant. He valued tradition anyway, because the alternative was what he saw when he looked at the parts of the empire that had drifted from the old principles. The factions that had replaced discipline with ambition, hierarchy with personal loyalty networks, long-term strategic thinking with the short calculation of immediate advantage. Those factions produced capable individuals sometimes. They produced unstable structures always. Empires built on individual capability collapsed when the individual did. Empires built on principle outlasted the people who held them. He had read enough history to know the difference. The Sith had collapsed before, multiple times, in multiple configurations, and each collapse had a common element. Not external pressure, internal softness. The moment when the hierarchy stopped demanding genuine strength and started rewarding the appearance of it. He would not be part of that softening. The cruelty people observed in him, and they did observe it, He was not unaware of his reputation was not recreational. Weakness presented itself as a small thing initially. A junior Sith who bent a rule here, stretched a principle there, found a comfortable arrangement that served personal interest at the expense of institutional integrity. Left unaddressed, that small thing became a pattern. The pattern became a culture. The culture became the thing that killed empires. He addressed weakness early. This was not pleasure. It was maintenance. The sacking of Coruscant happened in the 25th year 3653 BBY by the Republic's calendar, year 309 of the Sith Imperial Reckoning by the system Thanaton still used in his personal documents. The official Imperial calendar had shifted twice in the intervening decades, and he had declined to update his records each time. The Reckoning counted from the Empire's re-emergence from deep space. It was the oldest continuous Sith calendar in use. He saw no reason to abandon it, because administrators found it inconvenient. He watched the sacking from a flagship in orbit. The Senate district burned in a particular way. The buildings there were old, constructed with materials that the original architects had intended to last centuries, and they did burn more slowly than modern construction would have. The fires caught in the upper floors first and moved downward. From orbit, the smoke columns rose in a pattern that looked almost deliberate, almost arranged, like something a very large and very indifferent hand had drawn across the face of the capital. The officers around him celebrated. Thanaton did not. He watched the burning with the same expression he used for after-action reports. Measuring, recording, filing. Coruscant was a significant military achievement. The psychological impact on the Republic would be substantial. The treaty that followed would reshape the galactic balance in ways that would take years to fully understand. These were facts. They did not require celebration. He left the observation deck when the fires had been burning for 2 hours and went to his quarters. He cleaned the saber staff, as he did every night. Each emitter housing, each section of the hilt, the inspection port, checked and closed. The third synth leather wrap had been on the weapon for 2 years now. It was performing well. He tested the grip pressure, the balance, the weight distribution. Everything was exactly as it had been. He set the weapon on the desk and stood at the viewport. Below, Coruscant was still burning. He was not thinking about the fires. He was thinking about what came after them. The treaty, the Cold War, that would follow. The new phase of a conflict that had been running for almost 30 years and was about to change shape without ending. The Republic would recover. Republics always recovered if you gave them enough time, because they had a structural resilience that came from distributing power across many points rather than concentrating it in a few. That resilience was also their greatest weakness. Distributed power moved slowly. Distributed power required consensus. In a galaxy where the capacity for decisive action determined survival, consensus was a luxury that eventually ran out. He had been a slave in a distributed power structure once. He understood, at a level that was not theoretical, what it felt like to be a small person in a large system that did not consider your existence worth accounting for. He had no sympathy for the Republic, but he respected its resilience the way he respected all genuine structural qualities. Clearly, without warmth, because clarity was the only form of respect that meant anything. The saber staff sat on the desk behind him, 25 years old now. The hilt was darker than it had been on Korriban, not from damage but from contact, from the daily presence of the same hand over decades, the oils and pressure of consistent use leaving their mark on the kurtosis surface in ways that no amount of cleaning fully reversed. The third wrap was darker than the second had been, and the second darker than the first. Each replacement had matched the original specification exactly. Each one had still come out slightly darker. He did not find this troubling. Things changed through use. That was not deterioration. That was evidence of a life being lived with the same object in hand, year after year, which was its own form of integrity. The fractured crystal was still fractured. The thin diagonal line through the second crystal's core, discovered 13 years ago, left in place by deliberate choice, had not grown, had not spread, had not affected function in any observable way. It was simply there, a record of the beginning, a record of a man who had not known what he was doing, working in a cold antechamber with borrowed components and no supervisor, building the first thing he had ever genuinely owned. Thanaton looked at the burning planet for another hour. Then he went to sleep. The weapon sat on the desk in the dark, both emitters cold, the fractured crystal holding its thin line in silence. Outside, Coruscant continued to burn. The war that had lasted 25 years was about to become something different. The man who had carried the same weapon through all of it was already thinking about what came next. Power looks different from inside it. From outside, a seat on the Dark Council appears to be an arrival, the endpoint of ambition, the place where everything before it becomes prologue. From inside, it is something else entirely, a position that must be maintained constantly, defended quietly, fed with the right decisions at the right moments, or it begins to erode in ways that are invisible until they are not. Thanaton had held his seat for 12 years. He understood by now exactly what it cost. The sphere of ancient knowledge occupied a specific place in the Dark Council's architecture. Not the most visible sphere, not the one that commanded armies or managed supply lines or handled diplomatic contacts with client worlds. Ancient knowledge was slower than all of that, deeper. Its function was preservation, collecting, cataloging, and protecting the accumulated wisdom of every Sith Lord who had ever committed thought to stone, to datapad, to holocron, to the walls of a tomb on a world that no longer had a living population. Most of his colleagues considered it a secondary sphere. Thanaton considered it the only one that mattered. Everything the Sith were, every technique, every principle, every tactical innovation that had allowed the Empire to survive multiple collapses and return stronger each time, lived in the archives his sphere controlled. Remove the armies and the Empire bled. Remove the supply lines and it starved. Remove the accumulated knowledge and it forgot what it was. Forgetting what you were was how you became something weaker. He had seen it happen in smaller structures. A unit that stopped training the old forms because a new officer preferred different methods. A research division that discarded documentation from previous eras because the current staff found the format inconvenient. Small losses each time. The kind of thing that did not show consequences for years, sometimes decades, and then showed them all at once. His job was to prevent that at the scale of an empire. He took the job seriously in a way that his colleagues occasionally found excessive. The great Sith archives on Dromund Kaas occupied 3 levels of a structure that had been expanded 7 times since the original construction. Thanaton had commissioned the most recent expansion himself. Additional climate-controlled storage for physical documents, a new holocron containment wing, a restricted access tier for materials he had personally assessed as requiring controlled distribution. That last addition had caused friction. Several junior members of his sphere had objected, politely, through proper channels in the careful language that people used when they wanted to challenge a superior without appearing to challenge a superior. Their argument was that restricted access created information bottlenecks that slowed research. Their real concern, which none of them stated directly, was that restricted access gave Thanaton personal control over which parts of Sith history were available to whom. They were correct. That was exactly what it did. He had approved the addition anyway. The archives contained materials that were not dangerous in the way a weapon was dangerous. Not immediately, not obviously, but ideas had a particular kind of danger that physical objects did not. A weapon required a hand to use it. An idea moved on its own once released, spreading through an institution, the way water moved through cracked stone, finding every weakness, widening every gap. Some ideas in the archives were fractures waiting to happen. He was the one who decided which ones. The saber staff was present at the archives every day, clipped to his belt, both emitters cold, the dark hilt visible against the formal robes he wore in the archive's administrative wing. He had been asked once, by a new staff member who did not yet understand the culture of the sphere, whether he found it uncomfortable to carry a weapon during research work. He had looked at the staff member for a long moment. Then he had explained, in a tone that closed the subject permanently, that the weapon was not carried for comfort or discomfort. It was carried because it was his, because in a building full of materials that belonged to the sphere, to the empire, to the history of a civilization, the saber staff on his belt was the single object present, whose complete history he could account for, every component, every decision made during its construction, every repair, every maintenance session, every campaign in which it had been drawn. The staff member had not asked again. The trial of Darth Victon happened in the 42nd year of Thanaton's time as a named Sith Lord, year 12 of the post-treaty calendar, which was what the administrative wing used, regardless of his personal preference for the reckoning. Victon had been a mid-ranking Dark Council member, junior in seniority, who had made a series of decisions over the previous 3 years that could be interpreted two ways. The generous interpretation was incompetence. A Sith Lord whose reach had exceeded his capability, who had overextended his sphere's resources in pursuit of objectives that were theoretically sound but practically disastrous. The less generous interpretation was deliberate sabotage of a rival's supply network, disguised as incompetence. Thanaton had reviewed the documentation himself. Both interpretations were technically supportable. The evidence did not definitively confirm either one. He voted for execution anyway, not because he was certain of the sabotage, because a Dark Council member who produced this quality of outcome, for whatever reason, was a liability the Empire could not absorb at this particular moment in the Cold War. Incompetence and deliberate harm produced identical results at the operational level. The distinction mattered philosophically. It did not change the practical calculation. The trial lasted 4 hours. Throughout it, the saber staff sat at his belt, both emitters visible under the chamber's overhead lights. The dark cortotosis hilt, the third synth leather wrap, now 3 years old and performing well. Both housings gleaming with the particular dull shine of metal that had been cleaned consistently for decades. He did not draw it. He did not need to draw it. A Dark Council member's weapon at rest carried its own weight in a room full of people who understood what it meant to have earned the right to carry one. Its presence was its statement. He had learned this in the first years after his naming, that the saber staff on his belt, in a formal proceeding, communicated more than the same weapon in his hand would have. A drawn weapon was a response to a specific threat. A holstered weapon was a permanent condition. Victon was removed from the council and executed before the following morning. Thanaton returned to the archives. The studies continued. Ajunta Pal first. The earliest of the great Dark Lords, the Jedi exile who had established the original Sith Empire on Korriban before Thanaton's own ancestors had learned to count years. Pal's writings were fragmented, the original texts largely lost. What survived mostly reconstructions from later scholars who had found partial inscriptions in the tombs. What remained was enough to work with. Paul had understood something that later Sith Lords had repeatedly forgotten and repeatedly rediscovered, that the dark side was not power itself, it was access to power. The difference was significant. Marka Ragnos next. the Great Hyperspace War era, a ruler who had maintained the Sith Empire's stability for a century through a combination of genuine strength and structural intelligence. The ability to build institutions that functioned without requiring his constant personal attention. Ragnos had understood that a leader who could not be replaced had built a fragile thing, regardless of how powerful that leader was personally. Tulak Horde, Naga Sado, each one a different configuration of the same fundamental question. What does it actually take to build something that lasts? The answer, repeated across every source, was never comfortable. It took the willingness to be genuinely cruel in the service of genuine principle. Not performative cruelty, not the kind that advertised itself and sought witnesses, the kind that made difficult decisions quietly and did not require validation, the kind that a man could carry for decades without needing anyone else to confirm it had been correct. Thanaton had made peace with that requirement a long time ago. The report on Lord Zash arrived on a standard administrative morning. It came through the intelligence channel his sphere maintained on force-sensitive individuals displaying unusual rates of development, a monitoring function he had established 8 years earlier, justified to his colleagues as early identification of talent, functioning in practice as early identification of threats. Lord Zash was not the subject of the report. Her apprentice was. The details were sparse in the way early intelligence reports always were. Fragments, observations, incomplete data assembled into a partial picture. A slave-born inquisitor. No formal lineage, no academy cohort of note, no patron on the Dark Council. Gathering power through means that the report described as unconventional, and that Thanaton read as reckless. Sith artifacts, cult allegiances, force techniques that were not standard curriculum. He read the report twice. Then he set it down and picked up the saber staff. Not deliberately. The motion was automatic. The reach for the weapon, when the mind needed something physical to anchor itself against an uncomfortable thought. He held the hilt without activating it. Both hands on the center grip, the weight familiar, in the way that only things carried for decades became familiar. A slave-born Sith gathering power outside conventional structures. He knew exactly what that looked like from the inside. He had been that person. The parallel was precise enough to be uncomfortable, and Thanaton did not allow himself the comfort of pretending otherwise. The same beginning, property, then student, then something the hierarchy had not planned for. The same speed of development that made senior Sith nervous. The same quality of ambition that did not announce itself through the usual channels, because it had learned early that the usual channels were not designed for people like him. He did not find this touching. A mirror was not a compliment. A mirror showed you the thing clearly so you could assess it accurately. And what Thanaton saw in this assessment was not a younger version of himself that deserved protection. It was a structural problem moving through his sphere's area of influence, faster than the hierarchy had anticipated. He had survived his own beginning by being genuinely stronger than everyone who had tried to stop him. The question was whether this apprentice was the same. He set the saber staff down on his desk. The motion was small, unconscious. The weapon touched the desk surface without sound. The synth leather wrap, absorbing the contact the way it absorbed everything, quietly, without marking the surface below. He pulled up the holorecording, attached to the report. The apprentice moved through a Sith ruin on a world the recording did not name, gathering something from an altar that the intelligence operative had not been close enough to identify. The footage was low resolution. The figure was small on the screen, moving with a purpose that the recording captured even at this quality. Not the purpose of someone following instructions, but the purpose of someone executing a plan they had made themselves. Thanaton watched the recording to its end. Then he watched it again. The saber staff sat on the desk beside him, both emitters cold, the fractured crystal in its housing, the thin diagonal line through its core invisible from outside, present regardless. Something in the recording kept pulling his attention back. He could not yet name what it was. The tomb had killed 11 people, not in the way battles killed, not quickly, not cleanly, not with the straightforward logic of superior force meeting inferior resistance. The 11 had died in the way things died inside old Sith structures. Slowly, and with the particular confusion of someone who had entered a place, believing they understood its danger, and discovered too late that they had understood nothing. Darth Andrew's ghost did not announce itself. It waited. 2 years had passed since the holo recording. In that time, Thanaton had continued to monitor Lord Calig's progress through channels that the Inquisitor almost certainly knew existed and could do nothing about. The reports had arrived regularly. Every few weeks, sometimes more frequently when the activity warranted it. And each one had required him to revise his initial assessment upward, not slightly upward, significantly. The Force ghost binding had been the first serious revision. Binding a single ghost was a known technique. Difficult, dangerous, requiring a level of raw force sensitivity that most Sith did not possess, but documented in the archives and achievable by a sufficiently capable practitioner. Calig had bound multiple ghosts. The reports used careful administrative language that Thanaton read through immediately. Phrases like unconventional force technique and atypical power manifestation that translated plainly into, "We do not fully understand what this person has done." He understood it. He had read the original documentation on Calig's lineage, the connection to the ancient Sith Lord Aloysius Calig, whose own ghost had apparently been among those bound, a slave-born inquisitor who had discovered a Force heritage that predated their enslavement and had used that heritage to build a technique that the current Sith hierarchy had no established counter for. The structural problem he had identified 2 years ago had become more structural. He arranged the meeting through formal channels, a holo-recorded summons, brief and specific. Lord Calig was to present themselves at the tomb of Darth Andrew in the old district on Drummond Cass. A time was given. No explanation was offered. Senior Sith did not explain their invitations to junior ones. The invitation was the explanation. Calig arrived on time. Thanaton was already inside the tomb's outer chamber when the Inquisitor entered. Standing near the far wall, studying an inscription that he had read 40 times over the years and found newly relevant each time. The torches along the walls were old style, actual flame rather than illuminator panels, because Andrew had specified flame in the original construction, and Thanaton had not altered the tomb's conditions since taking stewardship of it. The light moved constantly. In moving light, the saberstaff at his belt caught and released illumination in a pattern that was not quite regular. The cortosis hilt absorbing some wavelengths, the emitter housings reflecting others. The dark synth leather wrap pulling in the orange tones of the flame, while the metal components gave them back. Not dramatic, just present. The weapon existed in the room the way it always existed, as a fact about the person carrying it, not a statement directed at anyone specific. He let Calig stand in the entrance for a moment, before turning. "You have been gathering power." He said it without a preamble, without the social architecture of greeting that lower-ranking Sith used to establish comfort before the real conversation. There was no comfort available in this room, and he saw no reason to pretend otherwise. Calig said something in response, careful, measured, neither confirming nor denying in any way that handed Thanaton a usable position. He noted this. The ability to answer a direct statement without actually responding to it was a skill that took years to develop. Most people learned it through long exposure to genuinely dangerous political environments. the kind where the wrong word produced immediate consequences. A slave-born inquisitor who had spent the majority of their life as property should not have had the opportunity to develop it. And yet, he turned back to the inscription on the wall and gestured at it with one hand, the other resting near the saber staff's hilt, not on it, near it, in the way his hand always moved when he was thinking through something that had no clean resolution. These words were carved before the Republic existed in its current form, he said. Before the treaty, before the sacking, before the war that your master Zash navigated so carefully while building the power base that you inherited from her. He let that last phrase sit for a moment. The Sith who carved these words understood something that has been forgotten repeatedly in the centuries since. That strength without foundation is performance. That a Sith who rises quickly without understanding what they are rising through will eventually encounter the weight of what they skipped. He moved along the wall, torch shadows shifting with him. You have risen quickly, Lord Calig. The speech took 20 minutes. He had not prepared it exactly, not written it out, not rehearsed specific phrases, but the substance had been forming for 2 years, since the first holo recording, since the first report that had required him to revise his assessment. The core of it was genuine. He believed every word. That was the part he would not examine too closely later. The saber staff was visible throughout. Both emitters at belt level, the hilt angled slightly forward, the way it always sat in its clip, a function of the weapon's weight distribution and the geometry of how he wore it, not a deliberate positioning. Torchlight moved across the cortosis surface every time he gestured. He gestured often when making this kind of argument, not broadly, not dramatically, but with the precise small movements of someone who had spent decades using their hands to anchor philosophical points in physical space. Calig watched him without expression. He found this more unsettling than he let show. Most people, when a Dark Council member delivered this kind of address, produced some visible response, deference or fear, or the careful performance of deference, masking contempt, that junior Sith used when they disagreed with a superior, but were not yet powerful enough to say so. Calig's face was doing none of these things. It was simply present, listening. He finished the address and gestured toward the inner passage, the corridor that led deeper into the tomb, toward the chamber where Andrew's presence had concentrated over the centuries of his burial. 11 people had gone down that passage on Thanaton's recommendation. None had come back. There are writings of Darth Andrew in the inner chamber, he said. Bring them to me. Calig went. The sound of footsteps on old stone faded as the Inquisitor moved deeper into the passage, then stopped, then nothing. Thanaton stood in the outer chamber and waited. The torches continued their irregular motion. The inscription on the wall held the same words it had always held. The tomb was quiet in the specific way that Sith tombs were quiet. Not the absence of sound exactly, but the presence of something that occupied the space sound normally did. Something older and less easily categorized. He had been in this chamber many times. He had never waited in it for something he was not certain of before. The 11 who had died in the inner passage had not been surprises. Each one had been an assessment, a person whose capability he had measured against the known parameters of Andrew's presence and found insufficient. He had been right each time. The ghost had taken them efficiently, and the tomb had returned to its quiet. And the problem those people had represented had resolved itself without requiring his direct involvement. He had sent Calig down the same passage with the same expectation. 15 minutes passed. The torches moved. The inscription did not change. His hand moved to the saber staff's hilt, not gripping it, just contact, the way it sometimes moved during extended periods of stillness. A reflex developed over decades of carrying the weapon in situations where the outcome was not yet clear. He brought it back to his side. 20 minutes. The silence from the inner passage was different now. Not the silence of something happening that produced no sound. The silence of something completed, resolved, finished in a direction he had not specified. His hand moved to the hilt again. Back. 25 minutes. Calig came back. The Inquisitor emerged from the inner passage with the writings Thanaton had mentioned, actually carrying them, which was a detail he had not expected anyone to bother with, and crossed the outer chamber with the same measured pace they had used entering it. They set the documents on the stone ledge near the entrance. Then they looked at Thanaton. His expression did not change. This was a trained response, developed over decades of political situations, where showing a genuine reaction to an unexpected development was a form of information transfer, giving the other person data about what you had anticipated and what you had not. He had learned to manage his face the way he managed the archives, carefully, with restricted access to anything that mattered. But his hand moved to the saber staff's hilt, and back, and to the hilt again. He did not notice he had done this 3 times in the space of a single minute. He was focused on Calig's face, on the same absence of readable expression that had unsettled him during the speech, now carrying an additional quality he could not immediately name. Not triumph, not defiance, something more contained than either. The ghost had not killed them. Andrew's presence, which had taken 11 trained Sith without difficulty, which had been the reliable instrument of its quiet management of problems for years, had encountered Lord Calig and produced this. The Inquisitor standing in the outer chamber, holding ancient documents, looking at him with an expression that revealed nothing. He had no immediate response prepared for this outcome. He had not needed one before. He spoke. The words were formal, controlled, a dismissal framed as a conclusion. The language of a senior Sith ending an encounter on their own terms, regardless of what the encounter had actually produced. He told Calig the documents would be reviewed. He indicated the meeting was complete. He used the tone that closed conversations. Calig left. He stood in the outer chamber alone. The torches continued burning. The inscription continued saying what it had always said. The passage to the inner chamber was quiet in a way that told him, without requiring confirmation, that whatever had happened down there was finished, that the ghost had been dealt with in some way he had not anticipated and would need to understand before he made the next decision. His hand was on the saber staff's hilt. He looked down at it. He moved it back to his side. Then he walked out of the tomb without looking back at the inner passage, without looking at the inscription he had studied 40 times, without looking at the torches or the carved ceiling or the stone floor that held the dust of centuries. The saber staff moved at his side as he crossed the threshold into the grey Dromund Kaas light. Behind him, deep in the inner chamber, something had changed that he could not yet account for. He did not look back. The walk back to the administrative wing took 20 minutes, through the old district's narrow paths. Stone walls, old construction, the kind of infrastructure that had been built during the original Imperial occupation of the planet, and never substantially updated, because the Empire preferred to build new things in new places, rather than renovate what already existed. He walked it without seeing it. His mind was already in the calculation, the new information, the revised parameters, the updated assessment of what Lord Calig represented, and what response that assessment required. 11 deaths, years of reliable results. One exception. One exception did not invalidate the method, but it changed the calculation of what came next. The saber staff was still at his side, still cold, both emitters dormant, the dark hilt moving with his pace, the fractured crystal in its housing, carrying its thin diagonal line, the way it had carried it for 3 decades, invisibly, consistently, without affecting anything observable. He had built this weapon from components that did not all match their specifications. He had adapted. He would adapt again. History does not record everything. It records what survives. The documents filed, the testimonies given, the accounts written by people who were present and chose to write, or who were not present and chose to imagine. The gaps between those records are not empty. Things happened in them. Decisions were made. People died. Objects moved from room to room in buildings that no longer exist, carried by hands that no archive thought worth naming. The saber staff was present for most of it. It did not choose to be. It had no capacity for choice. But it was there, at his belt, on his desk, in his hand during the moments he needed something physical to hold, while his mind worked through problems that had no clean solutions. 2 years between the tomb and the end. 2 years that the official record would eventually compress into a single line. Darth Thanaton, former member of the Dark Council, defeated in combat by Lord Calig, 3636 BBY. The line was accurate. It was also almost completely empty of what those 2 years actually contained. The Dark Council meeting happened 6 weeks after the tomb, not a full council session. Those were formal, documented, attended by all 12 members, and recorded in the Imperial Administrative Archive, with summaries distributed to relevant sphereheads within 48 hours. This was something smaller. 4 members, a private chamber in the lower administrative wing, no recording apparatus, no formal agenda filed in advance. Thanaton had called it. He arrived first. As he always did for meetings, he had called. A habit formed early in his career when he had understood that controlling the physical space of a conversation before the other participants arrived was a form of information, a signal about who had set the terms. He stood near the center of the room, rather than taking a seat. The chamber had a long table with 6 chairs. He let it sit empty. The others arrived within 10 minutes of each other. He had chosen them carefully, not the members he was closest to politically, not the ones who owed him the most favors, but the ones whose assessment of structural risk most closely matched his own, the ones who would understand the argument he was about to make, without requiring him to dress it in the emotional language that some council members needed before they could engage with a problem clearly. He made the argument plainly. Lord Calig represented a category of threat that the current hierarchy had no established protocol for. Not because the threat was unprecedented in type, but because it had been allowed to develop past the point where standard responses were sufficient. The Inquisitor had force capabilities that fell outside documented parameters. The power base was real, the cult allegiances were real, the ghost binding technique was real, and none of the conventional methods of managing a junior Sith's rise had produced results. He did not mention the tomb. He did not mention that Andrew's ghost had failed. He presented the problem as a forward-looking strategic concern. What this Inquisitor would become if left unaddressed, what that would mean for the stability of the sphere, what precedent it would set for other slave-born force sensitives who were watching how the hierarchy responded to this particular case. The saber staff was at his belt throughout. One of the 4 members, a woman named Darth Arctis, who ran the sphere of laws and justice with the particular thoroughness of someone who had never once in her career made a decision she could not fully document, looked at the weapon once during the meeting, just once. A glance that lasted less than a second, taking in the hilt, the emitter housings, the dark wrap. Then she looked back at Thanaton and said she would consider what support she could offer. The meeting ended without a vote, without a formal agreement, without anything that could be recorded, and later used as evidence of coordination. That was how these things worked at this level. Nothing was committed to. Everything was understood. He walked back to his offices through the lower corridor. The saber staff moved at his side. 3 months later, there was a night Thanaton did not record. It happened in a corridor on the administrative level. Not the public corridors that connected the main wings, but the service passage behind the archive's restricted access tier, which ran between the containment wing and the outer maintenance area, narrow, poorly lit. Used by archive staff for equipment movement, rarely occupied after the second watch cycle ended. He was there at the third watch cycle. He was not alone, and then he was. The Saber staff was drawn for the first time since the Outer Rim campaign, years earlier. It was active for a short period. Then it was not. Afterward, Thanaton stood in the corridor for 2 minutes without moving. Then he cleaned the left blade emitter with the cloth he kept in his inner robe pocket. The same cloth he used for the nightly maintenance routine. Soft enough not to mark the housing surface. The cleaning took less time than the standing had. He filed no report. He returned to his offices. The archive staff who used that corridor the following morning noticed nothing unusual. The corridor looked exactly as it always looked. Whatever had happened there had left no visible mark on the walls, the floor, the lighting panels, or any surface that anyone examined. The left emitter housing of the Saber staff held a faint discoloration from that night, a subtle change in the metal's surface tone, where the plasma had been held at activations slightly longer than standard engagement parameters, small enough that it would read, to anyone who later examined it, as ordinary wear. It was not ordinary wear. But no one who would ever hold the weapon again would know that. The formal address to the sphere of ancient knowledge happened in the 44th year of his tenure as a named Sith Lord, early in 3637 BBY, 8 months before the end. He called the full staff of the sphere's research and preservation divisions to the main archive hall, a room designed for exactly this kind of gathering: tiered seating, a central speaking position, acoustics that carried a voice to the back rows without amplification. He had spoken there many times. He knew exactly how his voice sounded in that space. He stood at the center position and let the room settle. Then he spoke about what the archives existed to prevent, not what they existed to preserve. Everyone in the room understood that part, had been selected for their positions, partly on the basis of their commitment to it. He spoke about the other side of the function. Preservation was not passive, maintaining the integrity of accumulated knowledge against the forces that degraded it. Not just physical degradation, moisture and time, and the slow collapse of old storage media, but intellectual degradation, the drift that occurred when each generation interpreted the source material through the lens of their current assumptions and slowly replaced what was actually there with what they expected to find. He had been seeing this drift in recent archive outputs. He named no specific individuals. He named specific patterns, phrases that appeared in recent research documentation that would not have appeared 15 years ago. Interpretive frameworks that introduced assumptions the original sources did not support. A general softening of the hard edges that made Sith history useful rather than merely interesting. The room was very quiet. He told them what he expected going forward. He told them what the alternative to meeting that expectation looked like. The saber staff was visible at his belt throughout. Both emitters under the hall's overhead lights. The dark hilt at the same angle it always sat. Present in the room the way it was present, everywhere he went. Not drawn, not referenced. Simply there, as it had been for 37 years, as it would continue to be. After the address, 3 senior researchers submitted transfer requests within the week. He approved all 3 without comment. The remaining staff produced documentation in the following months that met his standards precisely. The nights in the final year had a quality he had not experienced before, not fear. He had been afraid before, in the early years, in the campaigns, in the first months after his naming, when the vulnerability of a new position had been acute and real. This was not that. It was something more structural, a recognition arriving gradually rather than all at once, that the calculation he had been running for 2 years had variables he had not fully accounted for. Calig kept surviving things. The reports kept arriving, each one requiring another upward revision. The Inquisitor had survived Andrew's tomb, had survived subsequent attempts by Thanaton's allies to create complications in the Inquisitor's path. Not direct challenges. Nothing that could be traced back to a specific instruction from a specific Dark Council member. But the kind of institutional friction that the hierarchy was very good at generating when it wanted a particular outcome. Supply issues, permit delays, personnel assigned to Calig's operations who reported to other spheres. None of it had produced results. The Inquisitor moved through each obstacle with the same quality of purpose that the original holorecording had captured. Not the purpose of someone following instructions, but the purpose of someone executing their own plan, absorbing the friction and continuing. He had done that once. He had been that person in the early years, the one who moved through institutional resistance by treating it as weather rather than verdict, by continuing regardless, by refusing to interpret the hierarchy's discomfort with his existence as information about his actual capability. He understood at a level that his pride found deeply uncomfortable, exactly how this particular opponent thought. The night before the final confrontation, he sat alone in his private office. No staff, no correspondence to review, no documents open on his desk. The archive building was quiet at this hour. The third watch cycle, the corridor outside empty, the lights in the administrative wing reduced to the minimum maintenance level that kept the climate control systems functioning properly. He was holding the saber staff, both hands on the center of the hilt, the weapon resting across his knees, not activated, not angled for any ready position, just held. The weight of it, still slightly surprising after all these years, still carrying that quality of assembled components that exceeded the sum of their individual masses. Distributed across his hands the way it always had, he was not meditating. There was no technique being practiced, no force exercise being run, no mental preparation for the following day's confrontation being consciously executed. He had prepared. The preparation was complete. What he was doing now was not preparation. He was simply holding it. The cortosis hilt under his fingers. The third synth leather wrap, 4 years old now, performing well, slightly darker than the day he had installed it, as each wrap had been slightly darker than the one before. The emitter housings at both ends, cold, dormant. The fractured crystal in its housing. The thin diagonal line through the second crystal's core that he had known about for 25 years, and chosen not to repair. The record of a beginning that had been imperfect in ways he had never tried to pretend otherwise. Everything else in this office had been built by someone else. The desk had come with the position. Imperial standard furniture, assigned to the Dark Council member who occupied this sphere. The chair was the same. The shelving along the far wall, the lighting panels overhead, the climate system that kept the temperature at the level his archive staff required for document preservation. All of it institutional, all of it borrowed in the way everything was borrowed when you occupied a position rather than owning it. The saber staff was the only object present whose complete history he could account for. He knew exactly where every component had come from. He knew which decisions had been made during construction, and which had been forced by circumstance. He knew about the fractured crystal and the 2 emitter housings, and the 3 wraps of synth leather, and the campaign where it had first drawn blood, and the nightly maintenance routine that had kept it in this condition across 4 decades. He knew about the corridor. He knew all of it. There was something in that. In the completeness of the knowledge, the absence of any gap or ambiguity in the object's history, that the rest of his life did not provide. His position had been built through decisions that required interpretation, alliances that required trust, extended on incomplete information, judgments about people and situations that could have gone differently, and sometimes should have. The archive contained materials whose full implications he was still working through after years of study. The Cold War had produced outcomes that no one had fully anticipated when it began. The saber staff was clear. He held it and let that clarity exist for a while. Outside the office, Dromund Kars was dark and wet. The planet's perpetual storm system moving through its regular cycle, lightning pulling across the upper atmosphere in patterns that the original Sith settlers had interpreted as significant, and that later generations had learned were simply meteorological. The light came through the viewport in irregular pulses. The room went from near dark to briefly illuminated and back again, and each time the light came the saber staff caught it. The cortosis surface, the emitter housings, the dark wrap, and gave some of it back. He sat with it for an hour. Then he set it on the desk. He did not look at it again before he left for the confrontation in the morning. The weapon sat in the dark office, both emitters cold, the fractured crystal holding its thin line in silence, waiting with the patience of an object that had been waiting in one form or another since a sealed antechamber on Korriban 42 years ago. Outside, the storm continued. The lightning kept coming. The saber staff did not move. Corellia was burning before they arrived, not metaphorically. The industrial district on the planet's northern continent had been on fire for 6 days. By the time the Sith forces consolidated their position in the Old Quarter, actual fire, fed by ruptured fuel lines and collapsed structural supports, and the particular chemistry of a city that had been built over centuries with materials that were never meant to burn simultaneously. The smoke was visible from orbit. Ground level was a different quality of dark. Not the clean dark of night, but the particulate dark of combustion. Everything filtered through layers of ash and suspended carbon that turned the afternoon light the color of old metal. The ruins Thanaton chose for the confrontation were 3 levels below street grade. He had selected them for the same reason he selected everything. Methodically, after assessment. Below street level, the fire was less immediate. The structural integrity was better. The acoustics of the space were contained in a way that open ground was not, which mattered for certain force techniques that lost coherence in open air, and the location was away from the main Sith command positions, which meant witnesses would be limited to whoever he chose to bring. He brought no one. Calig arrived alone as well. This did not surprise him. The Inquisitor had understood, from the summons, what kind of meeting this was. Not the institutional theatre of the Dark Council chamber, not the managed ambiguity of the Andrew tomb. Something direct. Something that would produce a definitive result. They stood at opposite ends of the ruined chamber. Old stone, pre-imperial construction. The walls marked with the Corellian script that predated the planet's full integration into the Republic. Overhead, through gaps in the collapsed ceiling, the dark smoke moved in slow formations against what remained of the sky. Thanaton looked at Calig across the chamber. Calig looked back. He had spent 2 years revising his assessment of this person upward. He had never revised his fundamental position, that what the Inquisitor represented was a structural threat that required resolution. That position had not changed. The revision had been in the category of capability, not the category of problem. He reached down and activated the saber staff. Both blades came on with the sound he had heard hundreds of times. That long intake of breath held, and then the steady low register of stable plasma contained in a magnetic field. Deep red, the same color they had been in the antechamber on Korriban 42 years ago. The same color they had been in every engagement since, unchanged by time, or use, or the accumulated history of the weapon that produced them. The ruined chamber went red. Calig activated a weapon in response. Single blade, the configuration of an inquisitor rather than a lord, the color different from his own. The two light sources competed across the space between them, mixing at the center of the chamber into a color that had no name. He moved first. Thanaton had trained with this weapon for 42 years, not casually, not as a supplementary skill maintained at minimum proficiency alongside other priorities. The saber staff had been his primary focus in every training session since the first year after his naming. The technique refined continuously, adjusted as his understanding deepened, rebuilt twice from a foundation level when he concluded that what he had learned in the early years contained structural errors that would compound over time. The form he used was not standard Sith combat doctrine. Standard doctrine optimized for the double blade as an offensive instrument, the second blade as a constant threat. The fighting style built around aggression and the psychological pressure of two active dangers. He had studied that form, practiced it, and eventually set it aside. The form he had built for himself over 4 decades prioritized something different. Control of the space between combatants, rather than pressure within it. The saber staff used to define a zone, to hold positioning, to force the opponent into engagement, on terms that favored the weapon's reach advantage. It had worked in every engagement he had used it in. He opened with a lateral sweep that established the range, both blades describing a horizontal arc that covered the full width of the chamber at chest height, forcing Calig back or under, establishing immediately that the center of the room belonged to the saber staff's geometry. Calig went under, fast, faster than the movement parameters he had mentally assigned to the Inquisitor based on the intelligence reports. He adjusted, brought the trailing blade down and around, and the exchange became close, closer than he preferred. The reach advantage of the double blade reduced at this distance to near irrelevance. They separated. He reset. The Force Lightning came in the second phase. He had not opened with it, a deliberate choice, one he had made in the planning stage. Force Lightning, at the opening of a confrontation with a Force-sensitive opponent of this level, was an announcement rather than an attack. It communicated capability without guaranteeing result, and it gave the opponent immediate information about the primary threat they needed to manage. Better to establish the physical engagement first, to map the Inquisitor's movement patterns and reaction times, and deploy the lightning when the positioning made it structurally difficult to avoid. The positioning came 4 minutes into the engagement. Calig had moved to the far end of the chamber, the wall behind them, a collapsed pillar to one side limiting lateral movement. Not trapped, but constrained. The geometry of the space working against the Inquisitor's preference for distance management. He raised his left hand. The lightning came out in a sustained arc. Not a single strike, but a sustained channel. The full output of a Dark Council Sith Lord who had been building Force reserves for 42 years and had not expended significant power in the physical exchange that preceded this moment. It crossed the chamber in less than a second. Something met it, not a physical barrier, not a deflection technique he recognized from the archive documentation on Force Lightning countermeasures. Something else, a presence in the space between his lightning and Calig's position, multiple presences, occupying the chamber's Force signature in a way that had not been there a moment before. The ghosts. He had known about them intellectually. The intelligence reports had documented the binding technique, had described the ghosts Calig had accumulated, had given him names. Aloysius Calig, Horak Mul, Kalatosh Zavros, Ergast, and he had processed those names as data points in his assessment. He had read the available documentation on ghost binding and understood the theoretical basis of what the technique produced. Understanding something theoretically and encountering it in a contained chamber at close range were different experiences. The lightning hit the combined presence and stopped. Not absorbed, stopped. The energy redirected, turned back along its own channel, with a force that exceeded what he had put into it. The process was not instantaneous. There was a moment, a fraction of a second, where the lightning existed in the space between them and could have gone either way. And in that fraction, he felt the weight of what Calig had built pressing against what he had sent. Then it came back. The impact took him from his feet. His own lightning, redirected by the combined force of 4 bound Sith ghosts, hit him at the chest with more power than any single force lightning strike he had encountered in 4 decades of Sith combat. The sensation was not pain in any straightforward sense. It was a reorganization, the body's systems responding simultaneously to more input than they were designed to process, every muscle contracting at once, every nerve ending firing. He hit the chamber wall. The saber staff left his hand. He did not drop it deliberately. It was not a decision. His grip, the grip that had held this weapon through campaigns and formal proceedings, and 42 years of nightly maintenance routines, and 1 long quiet hour in a dark office, simply stopped being a grip when the redirected lightning hit. The hand opening reflexively before his conscious mind had registered what was happening. The weapon crossed the chamber. It hit the stone floor of the Corellian ruin 4 meters from where he had been standing. Both blades retracted on impact. The plasma fields collapsed. The magnetic containment released. The red light gone in the same instant. The hilt struck stone. The sound of it, metal on ancient floor, a sharp contact followed by the secondary sound of rotation, was distinct in the sudden absence of the blade noise that had filled the chamber for the previous 8 minutes. The hilt spun twice. The first rotation was fast, carrying the momentum of the throw, the emitter housings at each end, describing an arc against the stone. The second was slower, the energy dissipating, the weapon settling into the resistance of the uneven floor surface. It came to rest, both emitters cold. The cortosis hilt face down against the stone, the dark synth leather wrap in contact with the Corellian floor, the fractured crystal in its housing, carrying its thin diagonal line in the dark. It was the first time it had been on the floor since Korriban. Thanaton was still alive. The wall had stopped him, and he was on the ground, aware, conscious, conducting a rapid assessment of what his body could and could not currently do. The answer was not encouraging. The redirected lightning had not been lethal. It had been thorough. The distinction mattered in the sense that he was still breathing. It did not matter in the sense that he could not stand. Calig crossed the chamber. He watched this happen. The Inquisitor moving toward him with that same quality of purpose that had been there in the original holorecording in the tomb, in every encounter and every report for 2 years, not hurried, not performing anything for an audience that wasn't present, just moving toward the thing that needed to happen next. He did not look at the saber staff. It was on the floor 4 meters away. He knew exactly where it was. He did not look at it, because looking at it would not change anything. And he had spent 42 years not wasting attention on things that would not change anything. He looked at Calig. What followed was not in this room. The Dark Council convened in formal session 2 days later. Thanaton was brought before them. Not in the condition of a Dark Council member returning from a campaign. Not in the robes. And with the bearing of someone who had spent 42 years building a position in the Sith hierarchy, in chains. The physical reality of it as stark as any inscription on any tomb wall. The council deliberated. The deliberation did not take long. He had voted for execution himself in this same chamber, in proceedings where the outcome was similarly clear before the formal process completed. He understood what the chamber was doing and why. He had no objection to the logic. The logic was sound. A Dark Council member who had been defeated completely, publicly, by a junior Sith whose rise he had tried to prevent. That was a liability the Empire could not absorb at this particular moment. He had made this argument himself. The execution happened in the hours after the session. The records do not specify the method. The records do not include his final statement, if he made one. The records contain a single administrative entry. Darth Thanaton, sphere of ancient knowledge, removed from position. Successor to be determined. The entry was filed by an administrative clerk who had never met him. Back in the Corellian ruin, the saber staff was still on the floor. The fires above street level continued. The smoke moved through the ceiling gaps in slow formations. The chamber was quiet in the way that spaces go quiet after the thing that gave them meaning has concluded. Not peaceful, not resolved, just empty of the specific tension that had occupied them. The hilt lay where it had come to rest after the second rotation, face down on ancient stone, both emitters cold. The dark synth leather wrap in contact with the floor, the cortosis surface above it, the internal components in their housings. Power cell, focusing lenses, emitter matrices, 2 red kyber crystals that had been bled in a dead Dark Council member's weapon and repurposed in a sealed antechamber by a former slave who had not yet known his own name. 1 crystal pristine. 1 carrying a fracture that no one had ever repaired. The weapon had been built 42 years ago by a man who no longer existed. Teneb Kel, the slave, the apprentice, the person who had existed before the Dark Council, had given him a different name. That man had been gone for 4 decades. The name he had been given was also gone now, removed from the council records by administrative entry. The saber staff remained. It had no opinion about this. It lay on the floor of the ruin and waited, with the patience of an object that did not experience waiting as anything other than the passage of time. For whatever came next. Outside, Corellia continued to burn. Nothing came for a while. The ruin was quiet by the time the soldier found it, not peaceful. Corellia was not producing peace at this stage of the campaign, would not produce it for weeks yet. But quiet in the localized sense of a space where the immediate action had concluded and the next wave had not yet arrived. The fires above street level continued their work. Down here, 3 levels below the surface, the smoke came through the ceiling gaps in thin threads rather than columns, and the light was the same dim filtered grey it had been during the confrontation. The soldier's name was Verek. He held the rank of Lieutenant Executor in the Sith Imperial Ground Forces, a mid-level designation that placed him above standard infantry and below the Sith-born officers who commanded field operations. His job in this sector was area clearance, moving through recently contested spaces, cataloguing what had been left behind, flagging anything that required escalation to a higher authority. He had been doing this work for 11 years. He was good at it. The saber staff was easy to find. Not hidden, not buried under debris, not kicked into a corner during the engagement. It lay in the open on the chamber floor, exactly where it had come to rest after the second rotation, face down, both emitters cold, the dark synth leather wrap against the stone. Verek stopped 2 meters from it and looked at it for a moment before approaching. He had recovered weapons before, standard infantry arms, personal sidearms, the occasional lightsaber belonging to a Jedi or Sith, whose engagement had ended badly. The protocol was consistent across all categories. Do not activate, do not examine beyond visual identification, log, and transport. Personal curiosity about recovered materiel was a reliable way to have a very short career in area clearance. He crouched and picked the weapon up carefully. Both hands, one each end of the hilt, the way he had been trained to handle long weapons of uncertain condition. The weight surprised him. He did not know why he had expected it to be lighter. Saber staff construction at this quality level used dense materials throughout. The cortosis weave alone added significant mass over standard hilt alloys. The grip settled in his hands with the particular solidity of something built to last, built to be used consistently by someone who intended to carry it for a long time. He turned it once, visually checking for damage. Nothing obvious. The hilt was intact. Both emitter housings appeared undamaged. The synth leather wrap was worn in the way that expensive materials wore with long use. Compressed, slightly darkened, showing the history of the hand that had held it without showing any actual deterioration. He logged it in his field recorder. One saber staff, double blade configuration, dark hilt, recovered Sector 7 chamber. Condition appears functional. Then he carried it back to the command post. The command post was 3 blocks from the ruin, established in a Corellian commercial building, whose ground floor had been cleared and converted to operational use in the first days of the district occupation. It had the specific atmosphere of temporary military installations, organized in the ways that mattered for immediate function, disordered in every other way, staffed by people who were managing more information than any single person, was designed to process, and doing it anyway, because the alternative was worse. Verek filed his area clearance report at the intake desk. The clerk who received it was a young man named Toss, administrative grade, non-force sensitive, tasked with processing incoming material logs from the clearance teams and routing each item to the appropriate handling category. He looked at the saber staff entry, looked at the weapon Verek had set on the counter, and made a routing decision in approximately 4 seconds. Lightsaber, recovered, owner unknown, went to the recovered force user materiel staging area. This was a tent at the back of the building with 12 other items in it. Verek signed the transfer form. He left. He never thought about the saber staff again. 48 hours. That was how long the weapon spent moving through the post's handling system before it reached someone who understood what it was. 3 pairs of hands in that period, each one brief, each one treating the object as a category rather than a specific thing, each one filing the appropriate form and passing it to the next appropriate destination. The first was Toss, already mentioned, who had routed it correctly by category without knowing anything else about it. The second was a senior material officer named Drav, who reviewed the recovered force user items every 24 hours and made disposition decisions. This one to the field armory, that one to the intelligence unit, this other one to the general salvage pool. He picked up the saber staff, checked the log entry Verek had filed, noted the double blade configuration, and made a different routing decision than he would have made for a standard single blade recovery. Double blade construction at this quality level indicated a senior Sith. Senior Sith materiel went to the sphere representatives attached to each major command post. He filed the transfer and moved to the next item. The third pair of hands was a sphere of ancient knowledge attaché. A young woman named Res, junior grade, assigned to the Corellia command post specifically to identify and secure historically or archivally significant materials recovered during the campaign. She received the saber staff from Drav's routing decision and carried it to her workstation at the far end of the building. She set it on her examination surface and looked at it. Then she looked at it more carefully. The hilt construction told her something immediately. Res had spent 4 years in the Sphere's material identification division before her field posting. 4 years of examining weapons, artifacts, documents, and objects of every description that had passed through Sith hands across centuries of Imperial history. She knew construction signatures. She knew the difference between standard military saber staff production and the kind of custom construction that senior Sith produced when they built their own weapons rather than commissioning them. This was the second kind. The cortosis weave was high grade, the processing quality visible in the surface finish, a specific sheen that cheaper cortosis alloys did not produce. The emitter housings were hand-fitted rather than factory toleranced. She could see this in the seam lines, the fractional irregularities that appeared in handwork and were absent in machined production. The synth leather wrap was custom density, not a standard supply specification. Someone senior had built this, someone who had built it themselves, with attention to specific requirements, over a period that suggested multiple construction sessions, rather than a single continuous effort. She opened her inspection log and began documenting. The examination took 40 minutes. Most of it was standard: dimensions, materials assessment, condition rating, estimated age based on wear patterns, and material degradation analysis. The wrap dated to approximately 4 years prior, based on compression levels. The underlying hilt surface showed wear consistent with 40 or more years of regular handling. The emitter housings were in excellent condition, maintained consistently, cleaned regularly, showing none of the oxidation that appeared in weapons that had been left unattended for extended periods. Whoever had owned this had cared for it. She opened the crystal inspection port. 2 red kyber crystals, correctly aligned, 1 in each housing. She checked both through the magnification lens, the standard check for crystal integrity, looking for damage or misalignment that could cause blade instability. The first crystal was pristine, perfect geometry, no inclusions, no fractures. The internal structure, exactly as a properly bled kyber crystal, should appear under magnification. She moved to the second. The thin diagonal line was immediately visible under the lens, running through the core from the upper left to the lower right. A fracture that had clearly been present for a very long time, given the way the crystal's internal structure had organized around it. Not a recent impact, not damage from the combat that had presumably preceded this weapon's recovery. Old, built into the crystal's history at a point early enough that everything subsequent had simply grown around it. She noted it in the log. Second crystal shows minor internal fracture. Diagonal orientation appears long-standing. No observable effect on blade stability based on housing configuration. Then she moved to the left emitter housing. The discoloration was subtle. She would have missed it under normal examination lighting. It was the kind of surface change that appeared only when the light source was at a specific angle, revealing a tonal shift in the metal that was not visible in straight-on illumination. She caught it because she was using the angled inspection lamp she kept for exactly this kind of detail work, and because 4 years in material identification had trained her to move the light source rather than the object when something felt slightly wrong about a surface. She held the lamp at 3 different angles. The discoloration was real. A faint change in the left emitter housing's surface tone, not scratching, not oxidation, not the mechanical wear that appeared from repeated contact with other surfaces. A thermal change. Something had affected the metal's surface temperature beyond normal operational parameters. Extended ignition at high output. She had seen this before, on weapons recovered from prolonged engagements, where the user had maintained continuous blade activation far longer than standard combat required. The plasma field generated heat at the emitter housing, and extended activation concentrated that heat in ways that left traces on the metal surface, even after the weapon cooled. She wrote the entry. Left emitter housing shows miser surface discolorations consistent with probable plasma residue from extended ignition. Minor cosmetic damage. Origin unclear. Does not affect function. She looked at the discoloration for another moment. Then she moved the lamp back to its standard position. The discoloration disappeared into the normal surface tone of the metal. She closed the inspection port. She did not know what had caused it. She did not know that the left emitter had been held at activation in a poorly lit service corridor on Drummond Cars at the third watch cycle, in a space used for equipment movement that was rarely occupied after the second watch. She did not know the duration of the activation or the precise circumstances that had produced a longer burn than standard engagement required. She did not know the name of the person who had been in that corridor with Thanaton, or what they had discovered that had made the encounter necessary, or what had happened in the 2 minutes Thanaton had stood still afterward before cleaning the housing with the cloth from his inner pocket. No one knew. The corridor had shown nothing the following morning. The clearance logs contained no entry for that night. Thanaton had filed nothing. The person who had been in the corridor with him had filed nothing because they no longer could. Whatever had happened was between Thanaton, the corridor, and the weapon. 2 of those 3 were gone now. The entry in Ress's log would be the only record ever made of the discoloration. Minor cosmetic damage, origin unclear, and the log itself would eventually be processed into the sphere of Ancient Knowledge's Corellia campaign archives, where it would sit in a sealed storage tier for decades without being accessed. She set the saber staff down. She moved to the next item in her examination queue. The report went to her superior the following morning. His name was Archivist Primary Sun, a mid-ranking sphere official who had been attached to the Corellia Command specifically to oversee the recovery of significant historical materials from the campaign zone. He received Ress's examination report, read through the entries, and stopped at the construction assessment section. Senior Sith, custom build. Estimated 40-plus years of consistent use. He cross-referenced the recovery location and timeline against the intelligence summaries from the previous 48 hours. The cross-reference produced a name. He sat with that name for a while. Then he made a decision that was less a decision than a recognition of the available options and their respective risks. The weapon had belonged to a Dark Council member who had just been removed from that position by formal council action. Its status was therefore ambiguous, not the property of an active official, not the property of a deceased Sith, whose estate required formal administration, not unclaimed military salvage in any straightforward sense. Ambiguous status items in the sphere of ancient knowledge went to the senior archivist with the most relevant subject expertise and the most pressing need. He knew the right person, not a powerful Sith, not someone with a formal claim, an institutional position, or any particular connection to the weapon's history. Just the most senior archivist currently on Drummond Cars, who worked in the specific subfield that covered Old Republic Sith Lord material culture, the construction signatures, the historical context, the documentation of objects connected to named Dark Council figures. He filed the transfer. The saber staff left Corellia 3 days after it had hit the floor of the Corellian ruin, packed in a standard secure transport case, the kind used for fragile or sensitive archive materials, foam-lined, sealed with a biometric lock, loaded onto a courier vessel at the Sith Command port, along with 43 other items flagged for Drummond Cars transfer. In the case in the dark, the weapon made the journey back to the planet it had spent most of its existence on. The cortosis hilt, the dark synth leather wrap, both emitters cold and dormant, the fractured crystal in its housing, the discolored left emitter, the surface change invisible in the dark the way it was invisible under straight-on light. The foam lining held the weapon steady against the movement of the vessel. Outside the case, beyond the courier ship's hull, stars moved past in the particular silence of hyperspace. A silence that had no equivalent anywhere else, total and directionless. The absence of every reference point that made location meaningful. The saber staff had no awareness of this. But it was moving, for the first time in 42 years, without Thanaton. It moved toward a man who did not want it. It moved toward his hands anyway. The transfer document arrived on a standard morning. Nothing about it announced itself as significant. Veril received perhaps 30 transfer documents on an average working day. Materials moving through the sphere of ancient knowledge's processing pipeline, each one requiring acknowledgement, assessment, and routing to the appropriate handling category. The documents came in batches, sorted by material type, and he worked through them in order from the top of the queue to the bottom, without prioritizing any particular category over another. The saber staff entry was 16th in that morning's batch. He read the Corellia recovery notation. He read Ress's examination summary, the construction assessment, the crystal condition notes, the left emitter entry. He read Sun's transfer authorization and the subject expertise designation that had routed the item to his desk specifically. He set the document down. He picked it up again and read the construction assessment section a second time. Senior Sith, custom build, 40 plus years consistent use, recovery location and timeline, cross-reference to the recent council action. He knew the name the cross-reference produced. Everyone in the sphere knew it. The removal of a Dark Council member from their position was not a quiet administrative event. It moved through the institutional hierarchy in ways that were never fully official and never fully deniable. A current of information that flowed through the gaps between documented communications and reached every level of the structure within days. Darth Thanaton, sphere of ancient knowledge, removed. He set the document down a second time. Then he went to the materiel receiving area and collected the secure transport case. Archivist Adjunct Veril was 31 years old. He had been in the sphere of ancient knowledge for 9 years. Recruited at 22 from the Korriban Academy's secondary cohort, the group of force-sensitive students who had demonstrated sufficient aptitude for academy continuation, but insufficient combat capability for the standard Sith advancement track. The secondary cohort fed into administrative and research positions throughout the Empire's institutional structure. Many of them resented this. Veril had not. He had understood from an early age that his particular configuration of abilities, solid force sensitivity, reasonable analytical capability, no exceptional talent in any single area, was better suited to the kind of work the sphere offered than to the kind of work that produced famous Sith Lords. He was good at his job. Not outstanding, not the kind of archivist whose work drew attention from senior officials or produced findings that reshaped how the sphere understood its materials. Solid, reliable. The kind of person an institution depends on more than it acknowledges. The layer of consistent, competent work that keeps the filing current and the documentation accurate and the materials properly stored, year after year, without drama or recognition. He had a small office on the archive building's 3rd level, a desk, 2 shelving units, a personal storage cabinet for items requiring secure interim holding, a single viewport that looked out over the Drummond Cass administrative district. The view was not interesting. He had stopped noticing it years ago. He carried the transport case to his office and set it on the desk. He did not open it immediately. He made tea first. This was not avoidance, or rather, he did not identify it as avoidance at the time. He made tea every morning at approximately this point in his working day, between the document queue review and the first examination session. It was a routine. Routines were how he organized time into manageable units, how he moved through the workday without losing track of where he was in the various threads of ongoing work. The tea preparation took 8 minutes. He sat down at his desk with the cup and pulled the transport case toward him. The biometric seal released at his touch. Son had registered his credentials before authorizing the transfer. The foam lining held the saber staff in position. both emitters pointing toward the case's short ends, the dark synth leather wrap visible against the grey foam surface. He looked at it. Then he lifted it out with both hands, the way the handling protocols specified for weapons of uncertain recent history. The weight hit him immediately, that same quality that had surprised Verek in the Corellian ruin, the assembled weight that exceeded the sum of visible components. He adjusted his grip and set it on the examination surface beside his desk. He opened Ress's examination report on his terminal and began a parallel review, checking her observations against what he could see directly, confirming her material assessments, adding his own notes where his subject expertise produced additional context. The construction was exactly as she had described. He worked through the standard examination sequence methodically, taking his time, making notes. The hilt's age assessment, the wrap dating, the crystal inspection. He confirmed the fractured second crystal through the magnification lens, noted its long-standing character, added a cross-reference to the archive's historical documentation on construction phase crystal fractures in Old Republic-era weapons. Then he reached the left emitter entry. He positioned the angled inspection lamp, as Ress had, moving it through 3 angles the way her notes indicated. The discoloration appeared on the second angle. Faint, the tonal shift subtle enough that he understood immediately why it had required specific lighting conditions to identify. He looked at it for a long time. Minor cosmetic damage, origin unclear, does not affect function. Ress's entry was accurate. He could not add to it in any technical sense. The assessment was correct. The material characterization was correct. The functional impact assessment was correct. There was nothing in his subject expertise that allowed him to say more than she had said about what the discoloration was. But he had been in the sphere for 9 years. He had handled materials connected to named Sith Lords before. Not frequently, not at this level of significance, but enough to have developed the particular sensitivity that came from sustained contact with objects that had been in the presence of very powerful people for very long periods of time. He held his hand near the left emitter without touching it. He could not name what he was sensing. It was not a force technique he had been trained in, not object reading, not psychometric analysis, nothing from the formal curriculum. It was something more ambient than that, a quality in the object's presence that his force sensitivity registered without giving him language for. He pulled his hand back. He wrote his examination notes. He filed the parallel review. He noted the cross-references. Then he did something he had never done before with a materiel transfer item. He did not route it to the next handling stage. The dark cloth came from the supply room on the second level. Standard archival wrapping material, used for light-sensitive documents and objects, requiring surface protection during interim storage. He took 2 meters of it, brought it to his office, and wrapped the saber staff carefully. Not sloppily, with the same attention he brought to everything. The cloth folded cleanly at each end, the tension consistent, the finished package presenting no exposed surfaces. He did it the way he did the work that no one would ever see or praise him for, which was the same way he did everything else. He put it in the personal storage cabinet. He closed the cabinet. He sat down at his desk and looked at the closed cabinet door for approximately 1 minute. Then he opened the document queue and moved to the next item. He told himself he would catalogue it properly when he had time. This was not a lie exactly. He did intend to catalogue it. The intention was genuine in the way that intentions are genuine when they are made. A real plan, assessed as achievable, filed mentally under pending rather than abandoned. He had pending items in every area of his work. The archive's backlog was structural. There was always more material requiring processing than there were person hours available to process it. Prioritization was a constant. Moving one item to a lower priority tier was not unusual. He moved the saber staff to a lower priority tier. Days passed. The queue produced new items. New transfers arrived from the Corellia campaign as it continued. Documents, artifacts, recovered materials of various descriptions, all requiring the examination and routing work that was his primary function. He worked through them in order, methodically, filing each one correctly, maintaining the documentation standard he had held for 9 years. He did not return to the cabinet. At the end of the second week, he opened it once. Late in the afternoon, after the rest of the third-level staff had left for the day, in the particular quiet of an institutional building, after working hours when the climate systems produced the only consistent sound, he opened the cabinet and looked at the wrapped shape on the lower shelf. He did not take it out. He closed the cabinet and went home. Weeks became months. The Corellia campaign concluded. The processed materiel from that operation moved through the sphere's pipeline and out the other end. Catalogued, archived, stored in the appropriate tiers, accessible to researchers through the standard request system. Ress returned from her field posting. Sun filed his campaign summary report and was reassigned to a different project. The saber staff stayed in the cabinet. Veril developed a relationship with the cabinet that he would not have been able to describe accurately if asked. He was aware of it constantly, not in the way that powerful objects sometimes made themselves felt to force-sensitive individuals, not through any technique or active presence, simply aware. The way a person is aware of a door in a room even when not looking at it, the peripheral knowledge of a specific location. He opened it occasionally, always late, always after the corridor outside had gone quiet, always for approximately the same duration, long enough to confirm the wrapped shape was where he had left it, not long enough to touch it or examine it more closely, then closed. He did not ask himself why he was doing this. That was the most accurate description of his relationship with the object during this period. He did not ask, not because the question was unavailable to him, but because some part of his mind had assessed the question and determined that the answer was not something he wanted to have clearly. He was afraid of it. He would not have said so to anyone. He would not have written it in any document. The word itself felt disproportionate. Afraid of an object, afraid of a weapon in a storage cabinet in his own office. Afraid of something that had no capacity to do anything to him while wrapped in cloth and sitting on a shelf. The fear was irrational. He knew it was irrational. It was also consistent and real. What he sensed, without language for it, was depth, not power in the direct sense, not the radiating intensity that very powerful Sith Lords projected, the kind that made the air in a room feel pressurized when they entered it. This was different, quieter, the quality of something that had been present for a very long time in very significant places, that had accumulated the residue of those places the way stone accumulated mineral deposits. Slowly, invisibly, densely, the saber staff was 42 years old. In those 42 years, it had been carried through the Great Galactic War's final campaigns. It had been present in Dark Council chambers. It had been in the sphere of Ancient Knowledge's administrative wing during every major archival decision of the previous decade. It had been in the tomb of Darth Andrew. It had been in a corridor on Dromund Kaas during something that had not been recorded. It had been in the hands of a person who had spent 42 years becoming one of the most powerful Sith Lords of his era. Veril could not read any of this specifically. He did not have the technique. What he had was the ambient sensitivity of a moderately force-capable individual who had spent 9 years in close proximity to significant historical objects. A sensitivity that could not produce information, but could produce impression. The impression the saber staff produced was of weight, not physical weight. The other kind, the kind that accumulates in objects that have been present for things that cannot be undone. that have been held by hands that have made irreversible decisions, that have been in rooms where the galaxy's direction was determined in ways that were small in the moment and enormous in retrospect. He was not equipped for that weight. He knew he was not equipped for it. He left it in the cabinet. The 16 years passed the way years pass in institutional settings, in cycles of work and routine, in the accumulation of small competencies and small failures, in the gradual imperceptible shift of a person from someone who might become something else into someone who has become what they are. Veril processed materials. He wrote examination reports, hundreds of them, eventually thousands, each one accurate and thorough, and written in the same measured administrative language he had used since his first year in the sphere. He attended the monthly staff meetings on the third level and contributed observations that were consistently useful and never remarkable. He trained 2 junior archivists, both of whom were promoted past him within their first 4 years, which was exactly the outcome his training had been designed to produce, and which he accepted without visible reaction. He ate alone most evenings. Not from social difficulty, he was capable of the standard professional relationships that institutional life required, and he maintained them without effort. He ate alone because the alternative required more energy than the meal itself, and at the end of a working day, the energy balance favored the quiet of his own company. He had a small apartment in the residential district adjacent to the archive complex. He cooked adequately. He read, not professionally, but for the particular pleasure of following a sustained argument without being responsible for it. He did not have many objects that he considered his. The apartment was furnished with standard imperial residential issue. The tools he used at work belonged to the sphere. His clothing followed the archive staff standard. The few things that were specifically his, some documents from his academy years, a small carved piece from his homeworld that had belonged to his mother, the tea set he had bought with his first independent pay, occupied a corner of the apartment's main room, with the slightly self-conscious arrangement of objects that know they are filling a space larger than their number justifies. The cabinet in his office held the saber staff. He thought of it as his in the way he thought of very few things. Not owned exactly, not officially, not with any documentation to support the claim, but present in his space and his awareness in a way that functional ownership describes even when legal ownership does not. He never ignited it. He was not sure, across all 16 years, whether the fear was of what he might see or of what he might not, whether the concern was that the weapon would confirm what he sensed about its history, or that it would produce nothing, no impression at all, and leave him with the understanding that the weight he felt was not the object's accumulated significance, but simply his own imagination filling a gap. He left the question unresolved. He left the cabinet closed. The illness arrived in the 14th year. Respiratory, chronic, one of the conditions that the Drummond Carse medical literature had been documenting for 2 centuries. A consequence of the planet's atmospheric composition in combination with specific building environments. The kind of thing that developed slowly in individuals with a particular physiological profile and then became a permanent feature of their health rather than an acute event. It was manageable. The treatments were well established. He would not die from it imminently. He died from it in the 16th year. Not dramatically. He had been managing the condition for 2 years by then, attending the medical appointments, following the treatment protocol, adjusting his working schedule slightly on the days when the symptoms were worse. The condition was stable, then less stable, then not stable, in a way that the medical staff had not predicted and could not fully account for. The Drummond Carse medical literature documented this progression as well. The subset of cases where the expected trajectory did not hold. He died in his apartment during the night, between the second and third watch cycle. He was 47 years old. His replacement was assigned within the standard processing time. A young woman named Pell, 24, newly graduated from the secondary cohort, assigned to the third level of the archive building for her first posting. She arrived on a standard morning, received her orientation from the third level supervisor, and was shown to her new office. The office had been Veril's. The desk had been cleared, the shelving units emptied, the terminal wiped and reset to default configuration. Standard estate clearance procedure for Sphere staff. Personal effects removed to the administrative holding area for collection by next of kin or disposal. If unclaimed, institutional equipment returned to the relevant departments. One item had not been cleared. The personal storage cabinet in the corner, standard issue biometric lock, had not been opened during the clearance process. The estate administration team had noted it, attempted the standard override protocol, found that the biometric registration had not been updated to include any secondary credentials as protocol required, and flagged it for specialist handling. Specialist handling meant the third level supervisor. His name was Arvin. He had been on the third level for 11 years, long enough to have worked alongside Veril for most of that time without ever becoming exactly friends. Colleagues in the specific way that people are colleagues when they share a space and a function and a mutual respect that never quite develops into anything warmer. He had known Veril had something in that cabinet. Not specifically, he had not known it was a saber staff, had not known it was connected to Thanaton, had not known any of the details. He had simply observed, across years of sharing a building level, that Veril occasionally opened that cabinet late in the day when the corridor was quiet, and closed it again without removing anything, and did not discuss it. He had found this mildly notable and not his concern. Now it was his concern. He brought a technical override tool from the equipment room and opened the cabinet. The wrapped shape was on the lower shelf, exactly as Veril had placed it 16 years ago. The dark archival cloth folded cleanly at each end, the tension still consistent, the finished package presenting no exposed surfaces. The cloth had accumulated a thin layer of dust across the top surface, the kind of dust that accumulated in sealed spaces over years. Nothing had disturbed it. Arvin looked at it. He picked it up carefully. The weight was significant, more than the size suggested. He turned the package over once and felt, through the wrapping, the shape of a hilt. Long, double-ended. He set it on Veril's cleared desk and opened the cloth. The saber staff lay there in the office light. The cortosis hilt, the dark synth leather wrap, both emitter housings, the whole object, exactly as Ress had examined it 16 years ago, and exactly as Veril had wrapped it 16 years ago. The time in the cabinet had added dust to the cloth. It had added nothing to the weapon. Arvin looked at it for a while. He was force sensitive, more capable than Veril had been, better trained, with a more developed set of techniques for assessing objects of uncertain history. He held his hand near the hilt without touching it. The impression was immediate and substantial. He did not pursue it beyond the initial contact. He was experienced enough to know the difference between an impression that rewarded sustained engagement and one that simply produced the same initial signal on every approach. The quality of certain objects that were saturated rather than deep. That felt significant at first touch because they were radiating a surface charge rather than containing something layered. This was not that. This was layered in a way that his training recognized and his instincts flagged clearly. Do not push, not without preparation, not without a specific purpose and a specific methodology, and considerably more time than he currently had. He wrapped the cloth back around the hilt. He held the package and thought about what to do with it. The formal options were clear enough. He could log it as recovered institutional property and route it through the standard materiel pipeline. Examination, cataloging, archival storage in the appropriate tier. This was correct procedure. It was what should have happened 16 years ago when Veril had first received it. It was the proper thing to do. He thought about doing it. He thought about the examination report that would result, the subject expertise assessment, the connection to the recent council action, the chain of custody documentation that would place his name on the transfer record and create a clear institutional thread from Sun's original routing decision to whatever happened next. He thought about who would read that report and what questions it might generate. The second option required no documentation. There were places in the Sith world, specific places, known to anyone who had spent enough time in the institutional infrastructure, where objects of unclear provenance went when no one wanted the responsibility of them and no one wanted to formally discard them. Not the archive's general storage, where everything was catalogued and accessible. The other kind of storage, the kind that predated the current administrative structure that existed in the architecture of buildings built for permanence rather than function, that absorbed objects the way old stone absorbed moisture, quietly, completely, without record. Dromund Kaas had several such places. The Tomb District had the most. He carried the package out of the archive building that afternoon. No transport authorization filed, no materiel transfer form. He signed out for a personal appointment in the building log, a notation that required no detail beyond the time and the expected return, and walked into the Dromund Kaas Grey with the wrapped saber staff under his arm. The walk to the old district took 40 minutes on foot. He did not take the transport grid because the transport grid logged passenger manifests and a passenger manifest with a destination in the Tomb District. On the same day, he had cleared a deceased colleague's personal storage cabinet was the kind of coincidence that trained administrative minds noticed when they reviewed logs. He walked. The old district looked the way it always looked. Stone infrastructure from the original imperial settlement. Architecture built with the assumption that the empire would last forever, and therefore did not need to account for the possibility of eventual replacement. The buildings were in good condition. They were simply old, and the oldness showed in the weight of them, the density, the particular quality of permanence that modern construction deliberately avoided, because permanence implied commitment, and commitment implied accountability. He found the tomb without difficulty. He had been here twice before, both times on similar errands, both times for similar reasons, both times leaving without having filed any documentation about the visit. The outer door was sealed with a standard lock that the sphere's master access credentials opened without resistance. He went inside. The third antechamber was past a collapsed pillar in the inner passage. He moved through the outer chamber with the lamp he had brought. Actual flame, which he had chosen over a powered light source for reasons he did not examine closely, and into the first passage. The air changed immediately on crossing the threshold. Cooler, denser, carrying the mineral quality of spaces that had been sealed for extended periods. His footsteps were the only sound. The collapsed pillar blocked most of the passage to the third antechamber. Not completely. There was a gap between the fallen stone and the right wall, wide enough to move through sideways. He had used it both times before. He moved through it now, the wrapped package held against his chest. The third antechamber was small, 4 meters by 6, the ceiling low enough that he kept the lamp below shoulder height to avoid the sensation of the flame being too close to the stone overhead. The walls held no inscriptions. The floor was old enough that it had developed the slight unevenness that appeared in stone over centuries of slow settling. The alcove was in the far left corner, set into the wall at approximately waist height. deep enough to hold objects of moderate size, sealed at the front by nothing. No door, no barrier, just the depth of the recess and the shadow it contained. He placed the wrapped saber staff in the alcove. He found 2 flat stones on the chamber floor, fragments of the collapsed pillar that had worked their way this far down the passage over years, and stacked them at the alcove's opening. Not a seal, not a barrier, just a presence at the threshold, something to prevent the package from shifting if the settling process continued. He stood back. He held the lamp up and looked at what he had done. The wrapped shape in the alcove, the 2 flat stones in front of it, the shadow the stones cast against the back wall of the recess. Everything quiet. He did not know whose saber staff it had been. He had not asked Pell, had not consulted the transfer documentation, had not opened the examination report that Ress had filed 16 years ago. He had opened a cabinet, found something he did not want institutional responsibility for, and brought it somewhere institutional responsibility could not easily follow. He was aware this was not the correct procedure. He was also aware that correct procedure in this particular case, open questions he had no interest in answering. He turned and walked back through the passage, through the gap beside the collapsed pillar, through the outer chamber, and out through the sealed door. He locked it behind him. He walked back to the archive building in the same grey Dromund cast light. Arriving within the window, his personal appointment notation had covered, and returned to the 3rd level without speaking to anyone about where he had been. He sat down at his desk. The cabinet in the corner was open, empty. The dust-marked cloth was gone. The shelf where the wrapped package had sat for 16 years held nothing. He looked at the empty shelf for a moment. Then he turned to his terminal and opened the document queue. The queue had 17 items in it. He started from the top. The morning Arvin cleared the cabinet, Doss was on the 2nd level filing material transfer confirmations. This was standard work for his position. Junior assistant, 1st posting. The category of tasks that kept the archive's administrative pipeline moving without requiring the kind of judgment that took years to develop. He filed confirmations. He prepared examination queue entries. He moved physical items between the receiving area and the examination rooms, according to the routing assignments that senior archivists produced. He did this work carefully and without complaint, which was the correct approach for someone in his 1st year who understood that 1st years were evaluated less on what they produced than on how they handled what they were given. He was 18 years old. He had been at the archive for 7 months. He had known Veril for 5 of those months. Not well, not in the way that people know each other when genuine connection develops, but in the specific way that a junior staff member knows a senior one when the senior person is quietly decent, and the junior person notices this without having the vocabulary yet to name what they are noticing. Veril had shown him the routing system on his 1st week, had corrected his examination queue formatting twice, both times in a tone that communicated the correction without communicating disappointment, had occasionally left a completed task on Doss's desk with a notation that said only for reference, not instruction, not criticism, just the work done correctly, available to look at. He had learned more from those notations than from the formal orientation sessions. When the illness had taken Veril in the night, the news had reached the 3rd level the following morning through the same ambient institutional communication that moved all significant information. Not official announcement, not formal notification, just the knowledge moving through the building in the hours before the supervisor called a brief staff gathering to confirm it. Doss had attended the gathering. He had not said anything during it. He had returned to his work on the 2nd level and filed transfer confirmations for the rest of the morning. Arvin came to find him in the early afternoon. He appeared in the doorway of the second-level processing room, a space with 6 workstations, currently occupied by DOS and 2 senior archivists who did not look up from their terminals when the supervisor entered. Arvin was carrying something under his arm, wrapped in dark cloth, long. He looked at DOS. He tilted his head toward the corridor. DOS saved his current document, pushed back from his workstation, and followed Arvin into the corridor. The 2 senior archivists continued working. The door closed behind them. The corridor was empty. Arvin held the wrapped package out. "This was in Veril's cabinet," he said. "It needs to go to the old district. You know where." DOS looked at the package, then at Arvin, the Tomb District, the Andrews site specifically. Arvin's voice was level, not the tone of someone giving a troubling instruction, not the tone of someone who was comfortable with what they were asking, the tone of someone who had made a decision and was now executing it without revisiting the decision-making process. "You went there once before, for Veril." He had, 8 months ago, 2 weeks into his posting, before he had learned enough about the building's unofficial geography to understand what the errand had actually been. Veril had given him a small sealed container, a hand-drawn map, and an access credential on a data chip. He had gone to the address on the map, found the tomb, used the credential to open the outer door, followed the map to a specific location inside, left the container, and returned. He had asked no questions. Veril had offered no explanation. He had understood later that this was a category of task that the archive ran occasionally, informally, without documentation. "You're not coming," he said. "No." A pause. "File a personal appointment in the building log," Arvin said. "Return window of 6 hours. Don't take the transport grid." Another pause, shorter. "Don't log the destination." He handed the package to DOS and walked back toward the 3rd level without further instruction. DOS stood in the corridor with the wrapped shape in both hands. The weight was more than he had expected, significantly more. He adjusted his grip, testing the balance. It was slightly uneven, heavier toward one end than the other. The kind of distribution that required attention over a long carry. He looked down at the cloth wrapping. He did not open it. He had been in the archive long enough to understand that some questions were not asked because the answer was not the point. The point was the task. The point was doing it correctly, which, in this case, meant doing it without documentation, without the transport grid, without a destination log, and without whatever complications arose when those things existed. He went to his workstation, filed a personal appointment notation with a 6-hour return window, collected his outer coat and the access credential from his desk drawer. The same chip Veril had given him for the first errand, returned afterward, kept in the drawer since without comment from either of them, and left the building. The walk to the old district from the archive complex was not a walk that appeared on any standard route guide. The transport grid covered it in 11 minutes, on foot, using the direct path through the administrative quarter, and then the residential buffer zone, and then the old district's outer boundary. It was approximately 2 hours in good conditions. Dromund cars did not often provide good conditions. The weather system that perpetually occupied the planet's upper atmosphere produced ground-level effects ranging from heavy overcast to active rain to the specific combination of both that made the air feel like wet fabric. Today was the overcast variety, not raining. The light was flat and grey. The sky the colour of old stone. The clouds low enough that the taller buildings in the administrative quarter disappeared into them before their upper floors became visible. The temperature was moderate. The wind was present but not aggressive. He walked. The package was under his left arm, adjusted from his initial 2-handed carry once he had settled into a pace. The weight manageable when distributed against his side rather than held out in front of him. He kept his right hand free. The outer coat covered the wrapped shape well enough that it did not read as anything specific to the pedestrian traffic of the administrative quarter, which was sparse at this hour anyway. He had grown up on Dromund Kaas, not in the administrative district, on the planet's outer residential ring, the part of the imperial capital that housed the support infrastructure of the Empire's institutional core without itself being part of that core. His family had been in service positions, not slaves, not quite, but the category adjacent to it that the Empire produced and maintained through economic rather than legal mechanisms. His force sensitivity had been identified at 11, and his academy placement had followed at 13, which was late by standard metrics, but not exceptional. He had been good enough for the secondary cohort. He had been content with that. The archive felt like a reasonable life, not a grand one, not the kind that produced names in records that other people later studied. A useful one, work that mattered in the aggregate, even when no individual piece of it was remarkable. He had understood from his first week, watching Veril move through the building with the particular unhurried competence of someone who had found their correct level and settled into it without resentment, that this was a legitimate way to exist. He thought about Veril as he walked, not systematically, not with the structure of grief. He had not known the man well enough for grief in the formal sense, more the particular awareness of an absence that had recently opened in a space where a presence had been. The building felt different without Veril in it. Not dramatically, just different in the way a room with 6 chairs feels different from a room with 5. The same room, the same function, something structurally altered in a way that is subtle and real simultaneously. The package was heavier as the walk continued. He shifted it to his right arm. The administrative quarter gave way to the residential buffer zone at the point where the building style changed. The dense, formal architecture of the Imperial Administrative Core softening into the slightly less formal construction of the residential tier. Buildings with more irregular setbacks. Streets with a less precise geometry. He had walked this route on the first errand without paying particular attention to it. Now he noticed things he had not registered before. A carved relief on a building corner showing an imperial symbol that predated the current administrative period by at least 2 centuries. The slight upward grade of the street as the residential zone approached the old district's boundary. The way the overcast light fell differently on older stone than on newer construction. The old district began where the paved surface changed. Modern Dromund Kaas used a standard construction material for its pedestrian surfaces. A composite that was durable, consistent, and visually neutral. The old district used stone. Original stone, the dark red-grey variety that the planet's geology produced, cut and fitted by methods that the current imperial construction industry had not used for generations. Under his feet, the surface went from the flat predictability of composite to the slight unevenness of fitted stone. Each piece marginally different from its neighbors in height and texture, requiring a small adjustment in gait. He slowed without intending to. The old district had that effect on people who paid attention to where they were walking. The outer boundary of the tomb district was marked by a change in the architecture, rather than any formal barrier. Buildings gave way to older buildings, which gave way to structures that were not quite buildings in the functional sense. The tombs and ceremonial architecture of the original Sith settlement on Dromund Kaas, constructed during the period when the planet had been the Empire's primary seat rather than its administrative capital. They were maintained in the sense that they were not allowed to collapse. They were not maintained in the sense that anyone used them for anything current. Doss had been in the old district twice before this errand, once on the first visit for Veril, once on a separate occasion when he had become mildly lost during a walking route he was trying to establish, and had corrected his direction by following the streets back to the administrative quarter. Both times, the district had produced the same quality: a compression of presence, an atmospheric density that was not quite force resonance, but was not quite not force resonance either. Today it was more pronounced. He thought this might be because he was carrying something that contributed to it. He did not open the package to check. The Andrew site was in the district's interior, not at the boundary, not near any of the more visited ceremonial structures, but deeper in, where the streets narrowed and the stone buildings crowded closer together, and the overcast sky above became a strip rather than a plain. He found it by the same route he had used the first time, following the district's internal logic, which had a consistency that was easier to navigate by feel than by the hand-drawn map Veril had given him originally. Left at the carved column, straight through the narrow passage between the two identical structures that had no markings he could identify, right where the street widened briefly before narrowing again. The outer door, old wood in a stone frame, sealed with a standard lock that looked deeply incongruous against the surrounding architecture. A modern security component fitted into a doorway that predated it by roughly 2,000 years. He held the access chip to the reader panel. The lock released. He pushed the door open and went inside. The outer chamber was the way he remembered it. Torch brackets on the walls, old iron, original construction, currently empty as they had been on his first visit. He had brought his own light source both times, a small portable lamp, the same type the archive used for field examination work, producing a steady output that was not warm in the way. Actual flame was warm, but was reliable, in a way that actual flame sometimes was not. He held the lamp up and looked around the outer chamber. Stone walls. No inscriptions, or rather, inscriptions that had been worn past legibility by the combination of time and the Drummond Car's atmospheric moisture that found its way into sealed spaces, regardless of how carefully those spaces were constructed. The floor was the same dark stone as the streets outside. The ceiling was low. He had approximately 1/2 meter of clearance above his head, enough to move comfortably without being enough to feel unrestricted. 2 passages led out of the outer chamber. The left one was fully collapsed. A ceiling failure at some point in the structure's long history had dropped enough stone into the passage to block it completely, and nothing had been done to clear it. The right passage was mostly clear, with the single exception of the collapsed pillar that had fallen across it, at a point approximately 8 meters in. He moved into the right passage. The pillar filled most of the passage's width. The gap on the right side, between the fallen stone and the wall, was narrow enough to require turning sideways to move through it. He managed this with some difficulty, the wrapped package adding width to his profile that he did not have to account for when moving through such gaps unencumbered. He kept the lamp extended in front of him, watching the floor on the other side of the pillar while he made the lateral movement. The floor on the other side was clear. He straightened and continued. The first antechamber past the pillar was empty, a room that showed evidence of having contained something at some point. The floor marked with the circular impressions of large containers or objects that had stood in specific positions for long enough to leave their outline in the stone, but currently holding nothing. He moved through it without stopping. The second antechamber held several items, small sealed containers of the type archive used for fragile document storage, stacked against the left wall in an arrangement that suggested multiple deposits over an extended period rather than a single organized placement. He did not count them. He did not examine them. They were not his concern. The third antechamber was at the end of a short connecting passage, 6 meters, ceiling even lower than the outer chamber. the lamp necessary even with the slight ambient light that filtered through from the outer chambers. He stepped into it. The room was 4 meters by 6. He had measured it approximately during his first visit. The habit of someone trained to assess spaces quickly, a practice he had developed without intending to, and could not precisely account for. The ceiling height was lower than the connecting passage, which seemed wrong in architectural terms, but was consistent with the building's general disregard for standard structural logic. The floor had the uneven settling characteristic of very old stone, not dangerous, but requiring attention. The alcove was in the far left corner, set into the wall at waist height, approximately 60 centimeters deep, wide enough to hold objects of moderate size. The stone around it was undifferentiated from the wall. No carved frame, no inscription, no marker of any kind. It was simply a recess in the rock, deliberate enough to have been shaped rather than formed by settling or collapse. Old enough that its original purpose was not obvious from its appearance. On his first visit, Veril had sent him here with a sealed container of documents. He had placed the container in the alcove exactly as instructed and returned. He had not been told anything about the alcove's history or what else it might contain. He had placed the container and left. Now he stood in front of the alcove again with a different object and no instructions beyond. Take it to the Andrew site, and you know where. He looked into the recess. In the lamp's light, the alcove held shadows at its back that the beam did not fully penetrate. He could see the near portion. Stone floor of the recess, stone sides, stone ceiling approximately 40 centimeters above the floor level of the recess itself. The sealed document container from his first visit was not visible. Either it had been placed deeper than the lamp reached, or it had been retrieved at some point, or it was there, and the angle was wrong for the current light position. He did not investigate. He set the wrapped package in the alcove. The placement took a moment of physical adjustment. The recess was wide enough for the package's length, but the depth required setting the wrapped shape in at a slight diagonal. Not enough to affect its stability, but enough that the package did not sit perfectly parallel to the alcove's walls. He adjusted it twice, attempting to find a position that felt settled. On the second adjustment, he found it. A slight rotation that let the package rest against the left wall of the recess rather than spanning the full width, distributing the weight more evenly against the stone. He stepped back. He looked at the alcove. The wrapped shape sat in the recess. Dark cloth, both ends folded cleanly the way Arvin had wrapped it. The whole package presenting no exposed surfaces. The stone of the alcove surrounded it on 3 sides. The lamplight caught the top surface of the cloth and the near edge of the recess and left the back in shadow. He looked around the chamber floor for something to place at the alcove's opening. The purpose was not concealment. There was nothing to conceal it from in a chamber this deep in an unlisted structure that no one visited, but simple physical security. The alcove's floor was level, but the broader chamber floor had the settling unevenness that affected old stone, and he was uncertain whether vibration from the planet's weather system or its geology could eventually shift the package forward. He had no specific reason to believe this would happen. He had no specific reason to believe it would not. He found 2 flat stones near the connecting passage entrance. Fragments of something larger. The kind of architectural debris that accumulated in old structures as the slow physics of settling and moisture worked on them over centuries. The pieces were each approximately 20 centimeters across, flat enough on their top and bottom surfaces to stack with reasonable stability. He carried them to the alcove. He stacked them at the opening, the larger piece on the bottom, the smaller on top, positioned so that the combined height reached approximately halfway up the wrapped package's visible face. Not a barrier, a presence. Something at the threshold that would need to be deliberately moved. before the package could shift forward. He stepped back again. He looked at the alcove, the wrapped shape behind the two flat stones, the shadow at the back of the recess, the lamplight across the near surface of the cloth. He stood there for a moment. He did not know whose saber it was. This was simply true. He had not been told, had not asked, had not opened the cloth at any point during the walk to examine what was inside. He knew the shape from the weight and the dimensions. Long, double-ended, a weapon rather than a tool. He knew it had come from Veril's cabinet. He knew Arvin had wanted it moved without documentation. He did not know the name of the person who had built it. He did not know that the tomb he was standing in was the same tomb where, 16 years before Veril had received the saber, a Dark Council member had sent a rival to die, and the rival had returned alive. He did not know the significance of that event or the person who had been waiting in the outer chamber during it. He had not been born yet when it happened. He did not know that the tomb of Darth Andrew was the same structure, where Thanaton had stood with the saber staff visible at his belt and delivered an address about tradition and weight, and the danger of rising without understanding what you were rising through. He did not know that the person who had built the saber now wrapped in Arvin's dark cloth had once been a slave. He did not know this because he had never been told it, and he had never been told it because the record that would have told him. The chain of documentation from Ress's examination report through Sun's transfer authorization, through Veril's receipt of the materiel, had been severed at the point where Veril had decided not to catalogue it, and nothing downstream of that severance had produced new documentation to replace what had been lost. The saber's history was real. It was simply not in any record that Doss had access to. He was 18 years old and standing in a dark room in a tomb that no current imperial record listed as significant, holding a lamp and looking at a wrapped package in a stone alcove. And he had no framework for understanding what he was looking at beyond its immediate physical description. He did not find this troubling. He had not been given a framework and had not been asked to develop one. He had been asked to bring the package here and place it. He had done that. He thought about Veril for a moment, not with any specific content, not a memory of a particular exchange, not a reflection on something Veril had said or done, just the awareness of the connection. This was Veril's object, or had been Veril's responsibility, or had been in Veril's space, for a period that Doss did not know the length of. Whatever it was, Veril had kept it for reasons he had not explained, and now Veril was gone, and the object was here. There was something in that sequence that felt significant in a way he could not articulate. He was 18. He did not yet have the vocabulary for what he was sensing. He would develop it, over years, in the same way that people who work with historical objects in institutional settings develop a sensitivity to what those objects carry. Not through training exactly, but through accumulated exposure, through the slow building of a felt knowledge that formal education did not fully capture. He did not have it yet. What he had was the vague, present sense of something, a weight in the room that was not entirely explained by the stone and the dark, and the old sealed air, a quality of accumulation, as if the alcove and its contents, and the chamber itself, and the tomb around the chamber, had been gathering something for a very long time, and had simply not been asked about it. He held the lamp up and looked at the alcove one more time. The two flat stones in front of the wrapped package, the dark cloth, the shadow at the back of the recess. He turned and walked back toward the connecting passage. The return journey through the tomb was straightforward. Connecting passage, second antechamber, first antechamber. The gap beside the collapsed pillar. This time more manageable, his familiarity with the gap's geometry making the lateral movement easier than it had been on the way in. The outer chamber, the wooden door. He went through it. Outside, the Drummond car's grey was unchanged from when he had entered. The same overcast, the same flat light, the same low clouds. He estimated from the light quality that he had approximately 2.5 hours before the return window on his building log notation became unusual. Enough time. He locked the outer door behind him. The lock engaged with the specific click of a well-maintained mechanism. Clean, definitive, the sound of a seal completing. He held the access chip to the reader panel to confirm the lock had registered, saw the indicator light shift from red to green, and pocketed the chip. He looked at the door for a moment, old wood in a stone frame, the seal visible from outside, the mechanism invisible from outside, the entire door presenting a surface that communicated nothing about what was behind it or what had been placed inside it. He turned and began walking back. The return walk took less time than the outward journey. He was moving faster. The uneven stone of the old district under his feet, the administrative quarter ahead. The route familiar now, in a way it had not been on the way out. The package was gone from under his arm. His coat fell differently without the additional weight against his side. A small physical fact that his body registered without producing any significant response. He passed back through the old district's outer boundary, where the stone became composite underfoot. He moved through the residential buffer zone without stopping. He entered the administrative quarter and followed the direct route back to the archive complex. He arrived within the return window, signed back into the building log, returned the access chip to his desk drawer, hung his outer coat on the hook behind the workstation, sat down. The second-level processing room was the same as he had left it. The two senior archivists at their workstations, the document queues on the terminals, the ambient sound of the climate system producing its consistent background register. Nothing had changed. The room had not noticed his absence. He opened his terminal. The transfer confirmation queue had 18 items in it. He started from the top. He filed confirmations for 3 hours without interruption, moving through the queue at his standard pace, checking each confirmation against the corresponding transfer document, noting discrepancies where they existed and routing them to the appropriate correction channel. The work was the same as it had been every day for 7 months. The same structure, the same attention requirements, the same satisfying quality of a system maintained correctly. He filed no report about the afternoon. He did not mention to anyone where he had been. He did not think about the alcove while he worked. Not because he had decided not to think about it, but because the work occupied the part of his attention that thinking required, and the work was present and the alcove was not. At the end of the day, he closed his terminal, stood up, and put on his coat. He walked home through the administrative district in the same grey light, the overcast persisting into evening, the clouds still low, the lampposts coming on in their staggered sequence as the ambient light dropped below the threshold that triggered them. In the tomb of Darth Andrew, the outer door was sealed. The passage beyond it was dark. The outer chamber was dark. The first antechamber was dark. The second antechamber, with its stacked containers against the left wall, was dark. The connecting passage was dark. The third antechamber was dark. The lamp Doss had carried was gone with him. Without it, the room held nothing. No light source, no movement, no sound beyond the faint indication of the planet's weather system transmitted through the stone in vibrations too subtle for most instruments to register. The alcove in the far left corner was dark. The 2 flat stones sat at its opening, undisturbed exactly as they had been placed. The larger piece on the bottom and the smaller on top, the combined height reaching halfway up the face of the wrapped package behind them. The wrapped package was in the recess, the dark cloth, the folded ends, the shape of a long double-ended hilt beneath the fabric. The Cortos' surface under the cloth, The synth leather wrap under the cortosis. The third layer, darkest of the three, 4 years old at the time of the confrontation, and not a day older now, because nothing had touched it since. The emitter housings, the crystal inspection port, sealed, the fractured second crystal in its housing, the thin diagonal line through the core, unchanged, unrepaired, present as it had been present since the third day in the antechamber on Korriban, the discolored left emitter housing. The surface change invisible in the dark the way it was invisible under straight-on light. The stones did not move. The cloth did not move. The dark was complete. Outside, Dromund Kaas continued its weather. The clouds cycling through their perpetual system, the lightning moving across the upper atmosphere in the patterns that the original settlers had interpreted as significant, and that later generations had understood as meteorological. Inside the tomb, none of this was audible. The stone was too thick. The distance was too great. The saber sat in the alcove the way it had sat in Veril's cabinet. The same quality of waiting that was not waiting. The same stillness that was not peaceful, but was simply still. Behind two flat stones in a recess, in a wall, in a chamber, in a passage, in a sealed tomb, in the old district of a city that was itself old in a civilization that measured its age in thousands of years. Doss was already home. He was making dinner. He was not thinking about the alcove, or the wrapped package, or the weight of the object he had carried across Dromund Kaas on foot, without documentation. He was thinking about the meal and the evening, and the transfer queue he would return to in the morning. The stones in front of the alcove did not move. They would not move tomorrow. They would not move in a year, or 5 years, or 50. No one would come. No one would come for a very long time.